Lord of Mystery, Paradox Pathway by author D. Nan. Chapter 601-625. Chapter 601 Let Us Become One. Snow observed the composition of the ancient chaos, but the recall of memories did not stop. When the ancient chaos bombarded the barrier surrounding Earth at a terrifying speed, nothing happened. Given the immense size of the ancient chaos, and its speed, which even surpassed the speed of light, it couldn't even cause a ripple in that barrier. At this time, it was approximately the late First Epoch. The barrier on the surface of this planet was still solid, without as many cracks as later. The ancient chaos was like a puddle of soft mud splattered on glass, continuously spreading out, almost thinning itself to envelop the entire planet, yet it could never find a single gap. As the saying goes, life finds a way. In its blind and foolish state, the ancient chaos, driven by its instinctive pursuit of aggregation, activated the authority of the sphere paradox. Tendrils were continuously separated, becoming thinner and smaller. The chaotic, disordered, and multicolored mist infiltrated the barrier in an extremely subtle manner. The original barrier had a peculiar characteristic: it only blocked the entry and exit of outer gods, but it offered no defense against beings below the true god level. Rosal, at sequence 1, could land on the moon and return, but the mother goddess of depravity could only lie on the moon, gazing longingly. This was because they did not have the ability to actively split their sephira. Furthermore, detaching from the sephira and entering Earth at a rank lower than a true god would make them vulnerable to being severely beaten. But at that time, he was different. In his blind and foolish state, he would not worry about whether he would be severely beaten after infinite divisions, and he possessed the sphere paradox ability to extremely divide and refine sephira. Thus, he spent countless years decomposing himself into a massive number of tiny tendrils, carrying a minute amount of sephira that had already been broken down into particles, penetrating the barrier, and reaggregating on this planet to become the omnipresent ancient chaos. He devoured the meander characteristics of the knowledge and order pathways. His instinct for aggregation grew increasingly fervent through this process. Later, he was no longer satisfied with devouring characteristics compatible with his own nature, but instead regarded all meander characteristics as his sustenance. If another outer god or ancient god were to act in such a manner, they would have probably allowed the original will to revive within them. But Snow gradually realized another of his characteristics. His soul did not belong to this world. It was unlike that of any other living being. He was not a child of the original will. Therefore, even amidst madness and blind foolishness, his soul always maintained a relatively pure state. It could be mentally polluted, and it could be altered by external forces, but the original will was never present within it from the very beginning. However, this was not truly safe, because sephira was originally a part of the original will. The chaos and truth sephira that the ancient chaos occupied had already been mastered by him over countless ages in the cosmos. But if he were to continue devouring sephira on Earth, even if his soul did not contain the original will, it would be replaced by the will within the sephira. But here, he had to thank the Fool and God Almighty. These two, having accommodated sephira beyond their limits, could only choose death, sealing the sephira outside of the Chaos Sea and Sephira Castle in the West Continent. This prevented the ancient chaos from accessing other sephira. And Sephira Castle was above the spirit world. The only sephira the ancient chaos could reach was the Chaos Sea. If there was only one sephira, he could still slowly master it by relying on the infinite spirituality provided by the 1-foot rod. However, this required an extremely long time, so much so that before the ancient chaos's tendrils could even make initial contact with the Chaos Sea, the second epoch had already arrived. Many ancient gods who had accommodated sequence 1 meander characteristics and uniqueness began to slowly expel excess characteristics to gain thinking abilities, and this meant that the ancient chaos, lacking intelligence, lost its absolute suppressive power. Although he was still the most powerful being on this land, even ancient gods who were not even sequence 0 already had the qualifications to escape from his tendrils, and even gradually gained the power to contend with him. It was precisely from this moment on that the memories transmitted by the ancient chaos became increasingly abundant. Unlike the dull memories accumulated over thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of years before, after the start of the second epoch, each year's memories surged like a tide. Only then did Snow begin to realize the meaning behind True Creator's words, "Remember that you are you." When endless slaughter and devouring overwhelmed him, could he retain his original self? However, for Snow, True Creator had actually worried unnecessarily, because he was currently hidden within his stand, observing the memories from a third-person perspective. This is like personally killing someone versus watching a gore film. The former might twist one's psyche after killing just a few people, but the latter, even after watching dozens or hundreds of times, would at most cause disgust. Even if the number of deaths in the latter is infinitely greater than in the former, the difference between first-person and third-person perspectives can still bridge this chasm. The fusion of black mist and white mist accelerated, and the influx of memories also quickened. However, Snow felt no pressure at all, because compared to the endless years of the first epoch, the passage of a mere few thousand years was so insignificant. The intense memory infusion, on such a timescale, was almost instantaneous. And Snow finally saw the scene of the Silver City creator sealing the ancient chaos. With the completion of the Three Sages system in his memories, Snow's consciousness, through the stand's intermediary, truly established a connection with the virtual personality within the ancient chaos. Under the back door left by White Creator, Snow almost effortlessly completed the formatting of the three personalities. Immediately, as the memories of the contact were transmitted, Snow once again used eternal immortality to enter the shallow memory palace of the virtual personality, easily reviving from the consciousness of the Three Sages and taking over the massive and chaotic body of the ancient chaos. Within the mantle, the multicolored mist began to condense. A massive amount of spirituality surged from the 1-foot rod. The Sephira, scattered by the sphere paradox, began to reintegrate, and Snow also began to reversely compress the excessive Beander characteristics. Infinity equals infinity plus infinity. Therefore, one characteristic, after being broken down into an infinite number of particles, can be divided into two characteristics. Conversely, infinity plus infinity equals infinity also holds true. After completely breaking down all the characteristics, Snow compressed them into a stable structure of 1 part chaos plus 1 part truth. The sudden reduction in Beander characteristics instantly reduced Snow's mental burden. If not for bearing the Sephira of the black mist portion, the pressure Snow currently bore would even be less than that of a sequence 0 state. Extending tendrils to coil up the scattered Beander characteristics around him, secret supplicant, listener, shadow ascetic, baron of corruption, winner, demoness of afflictions, prophet, secret sorcerer, disciple of silence, pallbearer, Trojan horse of destiny, wisdom angel, hand of order, author, hand of God, as Snow once again held Paindrax's rule book, his body recondensed into a human form, and then, amidst a bizarre distortion like a television screen glitching, he vanished into the mantle. Chapter 602, Don't Throw Away the Time Bug. Snow's figure reappeared under the firmament, but the firmament, which should have been illuminated by the true creator, had once again fallen into dimness. Numerous divine powers intertwined in the astral world between the sky and the cosmos. Terrifying forces swept across the land in wave after wave, only to be intercepted by the true creator's power and vanish without a trace. Above the firmament, maddening gazes pierced through the barrier, observing everything happening on this planet. However, Snow keenly noticed that the moment his figure coalesced, one gaze silently departed. At the same time, Snow also discovered that he had a memory node, currently moving away from Earth, that could serve as a springboard. It seems I might be late. Snow gained some understanding of the gaze that had stealthily left, then grinned and looked at the true creator, who was neutralizing the aftershocks of the clash with the gods. Although he said that, it actually didn't take much effort. Seeing Snow appear, he immediately threw a mottled cross, completely enveloped in chaotic luster, and a rust-red broken blade to Snow, then spoke. Not late. To be precise, you're even faster than I imagined. In fact, if you were 5 minutes earlier, I'd have to make you wait, because this thing is more dangerous than I thought. Speaking of this, the true creator glanced at the cross in Snow's hand with lingering fear, and finally asked. Are you sure you can handle this thing? You don't need to worry about that. After all, the god of bound has already reincarnated. At worst, we can just do it again. How about exchanging her for the mother tree of desire? Snow's lips curved into a playful smile. Seeing this, the true creator also relaxed. He didn't say all that because he thought Snow couldn't control the item, but rather to use the conversation to judge his current state. Fortunately, the other party didn't seem to be affected by the ancient chaos. Snow also understood the true creator's thoughts. He tucked the cross into his "in my arms," then threw the rust-red broken blade back to the true creator. You should give this to Little Red. After all, compared to me, he should prefer to receive a gift from you. Medici, I do feel a bit sorry for him, the true creator sighed, but Snow said. If you feel sorry, just capture the primordial demoness and give her to him. That won't do, at least not now. The primordial demoness actively approached the primordial one to achieve godhood. Before we get the city of calamity, we can't let them confront each other. The true creator shook his head, also serving as a reminder to Snow. Snow understood his unspoken meaning and nodded. I understand. With that, he planned to use memory for a leap, but before he could leave, he was stopped by the true creator's power. Snow's gaze became somewhat puzzled, but the true creator showed a peaceful smile and said, "Consider it a bit of my selfishness. I hope that kid can learn something." Above the gray fog, Klein, wearing a semi-tall silk top hat, a double-breasted long coat, and a translucent cloak, stood in confrontation with Eamon, who wore a pointed soft hat, a classical robe, and a monocle over his right eye. Klein was in a very bad state. On his forehead, covered by a cold and eerie mask, a phantom brand had already emerged. It was a strange glowing door, stained with a hint of dark green. And Klein's body was similarly enveloped by something similar. Beneath the translucent dark cloak on his body, more and more slimy tentacles emerged, dense and squirming, growing longer and longer, occupying the nearby sky. With a subtle flicker in his increasingly dim eyes, Klein looked at Eamon and smiled. "For me, rather than you becoming the Lord of the Mysteries, I'd prefer the former one to revive." Just like the deduction show that arrives at the climax of a detective novel, Klein, with increasingly frenzied emotions, looked at Eamon with a mocking smile he had learned from Mr. Devil, and began his final deduction. "You were able to recover immediately after being contaminated by Saphira Castle and showing signs of madness, even reverse using Saphira Castle to create a blind and idiotic effect. You were able to not enter a semi-mad state after releasing your suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries, well within you, because there was an external force helping you. You must have a very crucial clone, or even a main body that has lowered its sequence, like Pale's, sleeping with Adam. He, the visionary, personally maintains your mental state. As long as the revival of the Lord of the Mysteries doesn't exceed Adam's tolerance limit, and that place doesn't lose control, you won't go mad. Therefore, your most serious hidden danger is that you must constantly maintain a normal connection with that body. Once interfered with, your state will have problems, and this connection is actually very fragile under the segmentation of Saphira Castle." Klein continuously attacked Eamon with words. Even though the other party kept reminding himself that the Lord of the Mysteries was about to truly awaken, he didn't care at all. Instead, he threw out the demand for a test of courage. Because he had seen through Amon's bluster and his cowardice, knowing he would never put himself in a desperate situation. The two were like race car drivers accelerating madly towards a finish line that was a cliff. Even if the end was death, they both still stomped on the accelerator. However, the only difference was that Eamon only hoped Klein would brake earlier, while Klein didn't care if Eamon braked prematurely. Of course, perhaps he still cared, but some things always take precedence over others. Amon's smile finally froze. He suddenly activated the door's authority, tearing open a rift and heading straight out of Saphira Castle. Just as Klein felt a sense of relief and began to use Beander characteristic aggregation to drag Eamon, forcing him to choose to actively abandon his life, Amon's body suddenly stiffened. Immediately, this Eamon, who was either a clone or his main body, and possessed the Beander characteristic of a dual-pathway true god, suddenly changed his expression, then revealed an extremely incredulous look. Subsequently, his pointed soft hat and his classical robe began to twist rapidly. Finally, a hand that should have belonged to him suddenly pressed on the monocle, took it off, revealing a playful smile that even Klein, who was almost completely replaced by the Lord of the Mysteries at this point, found astounding. Don't carelessly throw away the worm of time you release, or it will be replaced. Listening to the final words, Eamon completely lost consciousness. Moments later, in a darkness shimmering with faint water light, a young man with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face suddenly sat up, as if waking from a nightmare. He instinctively reached out his right hand, attempting to pull out a crystal-ground monocle from the void, but found nothing. After a moment of blankness, he looked vaguely towards a corner, as if wanting to say something, but ultimately failed to speak. Chapter 603, There Must Be a Master of Mysteries. On Klein's forehead beneath the full mask, the illusory symbol became increasingly clear. But at this moment, in this state where he was incredibly close to the Lord of the Mysteries, he clearly felt that another consciousness was growing within his mind. Adam. Klein suddenly remembered the strange look Adam had given him when he escaped from Adam with the Jinn's power. He was about to look at the Jinn, but before he could speak, the Jinn darted behind him and shouted, "You promised to shelter me." Shelter, ancient chaos. Klein suddenly recalled this existence, mentioned only in the narrations of Little Sun and Adam, and his expression immediately turned ugly. The man opposite him, who had changed from a classical robe to an Intis-style suit, originally had a somewhat gaunt face that also began to change, then transformed into a face he was incredibly familiar with. "You've worked hard, Zhou Mingrui. I'll take Saphira Castle now." A slightly sinister, mocking voice came from the other party's mouth. Klein was momentarily stunned, but the Lord of the Mysteries, consciousness, which had almost completely revived, prevented him from reacting. Seeing this, Feng Shui, who was in front of Klein, did not make any further moves. Instead, he spread his hands with a hint of helplessness and said, "Boring. Your reaction is really boring. Is it because of the fool?" As he spoke, he suddenly pulled out a not too thick, hardcover book that looked a bit like a toy book from somewhere. The cover featured 2 lines of artistic text, forming the main and subtitle, surrounded by tentacles and light clusters. The Advent of the Fool's Calendar. The Path of the Supreme Pillar. Almost instantly, Klein's brain, which was somewhat numb from the collision of 2 high-level consciousnesses, issued a strong warning. His spiritual intuition told him that he absolutely could not let the other party read it aloud. But at this moment, it was already too late. Before his power could reach the book, this young man, who looked identical to Senior Paindrax but whose sequence was terrifyingly high, had already opened his mouth. In the early morning of June 28, 1349, the great Lord of the Mysteries awoke from slumber and descended upon this tiny world. He is the great existence that traverses the past and the future, the ultimate ruler of the spirit world, and also the king of yellow and black who controls good fortune, and even more, the beacon for every living being pursuing eternity. He already existed in the super-ancient civilization before the distant first epoch. After a long slumber, the benevolent he awakened again, bringing the light of hope to this world on the verge of apocalypse. He has countless avatars. He is the best relative, the best friend, the best guardian, and also the wise detective, the righteous vigilante, the cold-blooded hunter, the charming maiden, and at the same time, the ruler who observes all beings above the gray fog. He is one, and also all. He is the beginning, and also the end. He is a moment, and also eternity. Stop saying it. Klein listened to Senior Paindrax's earnest voice, reciting the deified resume with an almost operatic cadence. An inexplicable force surged within his spirit, creating a slight margin for activity from within the 2 colliding consciousnesses. However, Feng Shui's words clearly would not stop. He earnestly turned past the prologue of the book and continued. On the day the great Lord of the Mysteries awoke, the Evernight goddess personally drew back the curtain for him. When he ascended to the human world, the god of imagination wrote praises for him. As he walks among humans, paradox must also cling beneath his wings. He controls the spirit world, and the 7 lights are his envoys. The Lord grants them knowledge, allowing them to share the Lord's authority in the spirit world. The Lord of the Mysteries desired to see the world, and thus the Tarot Club came into being. Only those among humanity who are righteous, benevolent, and compassionate towards the weak can receive the Lord's grace. There were 2 initial chosen ones, and both were watched over by the Lord. Alger Wilson is a descendant of ancient elves, a favored child of the sea. From childhood, he suffered discrimination, abuse, injustice, and all manner of evil. Yet his nature remained good, and so he received the Lord's favor. But he cherished himself too much, so the Lord bestowed upon him the symbol of the hanged man, to teach him sacrifice. Audrey Hall is the Lord's most beloved. Her body and mind are equally beautiful, the most dazzling gem among human jewels. She offered sacrifices to the Lord, and the Lord. Enough. Klein's face flushed crimson. Intense embarrassment and resentment, aided by a special power, briefly allowed him to breathe. He instinctively invoked the authority of grafting, throwing the book in Feng Shui's hand into a star countless light years away. Oh, ho. I wanted to continue talking about the outstanding contributions the members of the Tarot Club made to your cause. Feng Shui's smile still made Klein feel like punching him, but he ignored these things and said very seriously. Who exactly are you? Feng Shui, a transmigrator from the Zhonghua family, currently holding the humble position of paradox. Feng Shui replied, but Klein frowned. Then, he said with some trepidation. What about Mr. Devil? That's also me. Feng Shui seemed to have anticipated Klein's question. He casually pulled over the high-backed chair to the left of the ancient bronze long table, which had the paradox double pupil symbol on its back, and sat down, smiling as he said. We have always been one person. Klein was stunned for a moment. Then, under the powerful mind of a quasi-outer deity, everything since he met Mr. Devil flashed before his eyes like a slideshow. The morning prayers that disturbed his sleep daily, pretending not to recognize Chinese characters when presenting Paindrax's diary, and all sorts of perfectly timed echoing and mysterious knowledge. For a moment, Klein even forgot that he still had 2 consciousnesses pulling at each other in his mind, only wanting to dig out another luxurious palace under Saphira Castle with his increasingly numerous tentacles. Suppressing the throbbing in his brain, he stared at Feng Shui through the full mask. Why did you do this? For the advent of the Lord of the Mysteries. Feng Shui spread his hands, casually pulled out a bottle of happy water and threw it to Klein, then pulled out a bottle for himself, guzzled half of it, and then slowly said. The apocalypse is approaching, there must be a Lord of the Mysteries. All of this was an investment. Klein frowned, but Snow shook his head and pulled out several items from his person. A crystal pillar formed from light and shadow. A translucent, peculiar key. A crystal-carved monocle. A strange eyeball containing layers of illusory doors. I remember I should have told you that if you don't want to, I can send you back to the past. This is not a lie to deceive you. I still tell you this now. If you are willing, separate a sequence, one characteristic and a uniqueness, and I will send you back to a time before everything happened. Klein looked at the characteristic and uniqueness Snow offered, but shook his head. It's too late. The fool has already revived within me. I don't know how much longer I can suppress him, or rather, that I can still suppress him now is already a miracle. Speaking of this, he seemed to have thought of something else, then shook his head and said. And as you said, the apocalypse is approaching, there must be a Lord of the Mysteries. Hearing Klein's words, which gradually lost emotion without him realizing it, Snow suddenly laughed. He bared his teeth, but this time it was no longer the smile that seemed to mock all beings, but a reassuring and comfortable expression. Klein had seen this smile before, not long ago, when the three transmigrators were huddled in a hotel playing games. Looking at this smile, Klein felt a moment of trance, and then heard the person in front of him speak. Zhou Mingrui, have you heard of Pitu's paradox? Chapter 604, Pitu's paradox. Pitu's paradox. What in the world is that? As Klein's confused thoughts arose, the gray fog above Saphira Castle surged, and three large question marks appeared beside his head. Although Klein was a keyboard warrior, at most he would dabble in politics, or discuss weapons and movies, and browse forums. He had no impression of such an obscure term. Seeing the question marks above Klein's head, Feng Shui smiled slightly, leaned back in his chair, just as the fool had done countless times at the Tarot Club, and said, Pitu's paradox is a phenomenon discovered by Richard Pitot in 1977. In essence, it states that an animal's body size and cell count have no relation to its susceptibility to cancer. For example, the number of cells in a mouse and a human differs greatly, but their chances of developing cancer are almost the same. However, large animals like elephants and whales rarely get cancer. What does this have to do with me? Klein frowned, unable to understand why cancer cells were being mentioned here. It's simple, because after this, there's a hypothesis. At this point, a pointer appeared in Feng Shui's hand again, and a blackboard materialized behind him. As he stood up and tapped the blackboard with the pointer, lines of Chinese characters written in chalk appeared on the board. One theory suggests that cancer cells themselves lack tumor suppressor genes, which means that compared to normal biological cells, cancer cells are more susceptible to cancer. And the cancer that cancer cells contract will devour the cancer cells themselves, much like cancer cells devour the human body, ultimately leading to the cancer cells' apoptosis before they can cause disease. Quote! Klein was not stupid. Hearing this, he immediately understood Feng Shui's idea. However, he then frowned and said, if the Lord of the Mysteries is a cancer cell, then the supercancer that the cancer cell contracts would only be the primordial one, right? But how can the primordial one's consciousness awaken before the Lord of the Mysteries' consciousness revives? It's simple. Do you still remember the term, God paradox? Feng Shui's smile grew more sinister, but Klein felt a sense of great reassurance. He pondered the enigmatic God paradox mentioned in the so-called ancestor diaries, but ultimately shook his head and said, I know the content of this paradox is, can God Almighty create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it, but does this have any special meaning? After all, you've never actually told me what this thing is, have you? Alas, you just lack some associative ability. Feng Shui shook his head, putting his hands in his pockets. That stone that he himself cannot lift, God Almighty has already created it. As he spoke, Feng Shui pulled out a cross from his pocket. However, before the question marks on Klein's forehead could multiply, Feng Shui had already heard a string of standard open black lens bracket true creator curses close black lens bracket. My apologies, wrong one. Feng Shui awkwardly kicked Heaven Manufacturing, which was constantly spewing curses and threatening to hang Feng Shui from a lamppost, back into his pocket. He then pulled out the multicolored cross, wrapped in layers of seals and overflowing with pollution. Although he couldn't immediately identify what it was, Klein's instincts gave rise to a strong sense of fear and revulsion. It seemed to be a power derived from the marauder pathway granted by Saphira Castle. Klein involuntarily took a step back, but then his eyes lit up. Something that even Saphira Castle feared could only be the primordial one, right? Is the primordial one's consciousness sealed inside this? Klein subconsciously thought. You really dare to think that? Feng Shui rolled his eyes, placed the cross on the ancient, modeled bronze long table, and lightly tapped the table with his fingertips, making the faint sound Klein often used to attract the attention of the Tarot Club members. While provoking Klein's intense sense of shame, he smiled and said, "It's stained with the aura from Saphira, Mother Nest, Chaos Sea, City of Calamity, River of Eternal Darkness. If we unseal it now, it should also get some of Saphira Castle's pillars." Klein immediately recalled the knowledge from Adam, his expression horrified as he looked at the cross. This small cross actually contained the aura of 2 great pillars and the hidden pillar, 2 composite materials. Undoubtedly, this was indeed something that even the omniscient and omnipotent God Almighty could not bear. However, if calculated this way, the 4 great pillars were already gathered. If the Fool were to be tainted with this aura, the awakening of the Primordial One's consciousness would clearly not be an issue. The only problem was how to let the Fool be tainted with this aura. Authority. Without needing further explanation from Feng Shui, Klein found the solution himself. Whether it was the transmission of the door, the return after the error, stole, or the grafting of the Fool, all could send pollution into the awakening consciousness of the Fool. As an eternal and immortal existence, the Lord of the Mysteries would not care about the passage of time, nor about temporary gains or losses. If there was a possibility of being revived by the Primordial One, he would most likely choose to wait for the next opportunity. As long as he possessed the means to revive the Primordial One's consciousness within the Lord of the Mysteries' consciousness, he could indefinitely delay the Lord of the Mysteries' revival. Thus, the only remaining problem was how to prevent the Lord of the Mysteries from interfering with his authority now that his consciousness was highly awakened. "Let's go, we'll go to the astral world." Feng Shui wasn't worried about the Lord of the Mysteries preventing Klein from leaving Saphira Castle, because at this moment, the complete characteristics and uniqueness of the Fool were still suppressed by him with the outer deity's Beander characteristics. Even the Lord of the Mysteries, one of the 3 great pillars, before he truly revived, and while he and Klein were mutually constrained, it was impossible for him to seize characteristics from a full state paradox, not to mention he also had the 1-foot rod as an infinite energy source. As Feng Shui left Saphira Castle first, Klein also felt a dragging sensation under the influence of the convergence. And the Lord of the Mysteries, who was reviving within him, did not stop his actions. Even though the other party already knew all of their thoughts, the yet to be fully revived he had no better choice. Of course, perhaps he had already begun to plan some special preparations to bypass this infinite chain, but before that, Klein had already stepped out of Saphira Castle and entered the astral world, which was composed of symbols and authority. It looked similar to the cosmos, dark, deep, and boundless, but in reality, it had many peculiarities. The chaotic and mad underlying rules made it appear extremely distorted. As Klein stepped in, countless invisible gazes focused on him. A chaotic power spread from Feng Shui's body, clinging to the barrier like mud, obscuring all sight. Klein endured the tearing of 2 thoughts in his mind, following Feng Shui towards the Evernight Goddess's divine kingdom. However, before they could arrive, the Evernight Goddess, with a translucent veil covering her face and wearing a layered long dress adorned with stardust, already appeared in their sight. She glanced at Feng Shui, then looked at Klein, whose tentacles were constantly proliferating. She then raised her right hand, revealing a bird-shaped golden ornament. From the head of this golden ornament, within its bronze-like eyes, layers of illusory doors emerged, allowing a colorless drop of liquid, imbued with a strong aura of eternal silence, to fly out and land on Klein's cold, eerie mask. The consciousness of celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, which was tearing at Feng Shui's separated soul, was passively plunged into a state of eternal silence. Most of Klein's consciousness likewise fell into this state, leaving only a tiny sliver of lucidity. Klein immediately seized this opportunity, retrieved his mask, changed his cloak into a black trench coat, and then took the uniqueness and characteristics from Feng Shui's hand. Taking advantage of this brief state of eternal silence, he accommodated them. This will reduce the duration of the effect, and repeatedly using the water from the river of eternal darkness will make the fool revive faster. The Evernight Goddess didn't quite understand Klein's actions, but Klein just shook his head and smiled. This is enough. Saying that, he took out the cross Feng Shui had given him and peeled off the seals layer by layer. Including the fool reviving within him, the aura of the 4 great pillars instantly rose, transforming into an indescribable chaotic aura. The Evernight Goddess felt the aftershocks of that aura and retreated an unknown distance, but Klein, seemingly unconcerned, plunged the cross into his chest. At that instant, the authority of the door opened a light gate in his consciousness palace, connecting to the outside world. The authority of error stole a portion of the fool's slumbering thoughts from his consciousness, and the authority of grafting grafted the Saphira aura, which surged into his body from the cross, onto this wisp of consciousness. Feng Shui, who had been prepared, immediately pulled out the cross from his chest. Layers of seals completely locked it down. Klein then released the authority of theft, returning the already polluted consciousness. In the vast and distorted astral world, a silence lacking any temporal reference continuously spread. Just when Feng Shui and the Evernight goddess thought Klein had fallen asleep under the influence of the river of eternal darkness, he suddenly raised his head. However, Klein was not Feng Shui after all, and he didn't utter any mischievous lines like, "You fools. Thanks to you, I've revived." Instead, he stated a fact with a faint smile. The awakened consciousness of celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings has self-destructed. Chapter 605, A Few More Things. Amidst the Evernight goddesses, what kind of power is this? Bewildered expression, Klein and Feng Shui exchanged a smile. The two gently touched their chests, bowed to the Evernight goddess, and then vanished together into the astral world. The Evernight goddess watched their retreating figures but did not speak, for she knew very well that their relationships were different. She was an investor, a manipulator, but not a partner. The black night curtain fell like a light veil, and the Evernight goddess's figure also disappeared, while Klein and Feng Shui had already returned to reality. At this moment, Klein had already retracted his tentacles, once again becoming that impoverished history graduate, and Feng Shui had also reverted to Snow's appearance, adjusting his heaven manufacturing, which had finally finished its tirade. "This thing is very dangerous for you to hold, I'll keep it for now. Come find me for it after you've initially taken over all of the Lord of the Mysteries' authority," Snow said, tucking the colorful cross back into his pocket. All things possess divinity, except for Snow, and thus only Snow could long preserve this ultimate weapon, which held deterrence for any existence. "That kind of thing doesn't matter. In fact, I'd feel safer if you held it. Compared to that, give me a talisman of the ship of Theseus." Because Snow had revealed his true identity, Klein had no intention of being polite with him, and Snow didn't refuse, casually pulling one out and slipping it into Klein's hand. "I knew you'd need it, I prepared it long ago. But before that, there are a few other things I need your help with." "What is it?" Klein asked, not bothering to control his expression, looking very surprised. He didn't quite understand what else Snow, with his sequence above status, would need his help with. "Right, I want to resurrect Mr. Door, so help me keep an eye on the Mother Goddess of Depravity." Resurrect. Although Klein had long known that Snow possessed the ability to resurrect, would it even work for Mr. Door, who had been completely devoured, with not even a specter remaining? Just as Klein was thinking this, Snow suddenly pulled something out of his embrace, which almost made Klein's eyes pop out. Because in Snow's hand was a translucent, peculiar key representing the Key of Stars. Klein remembered very clearly that just a few minutes ago, that Key of Stars characteristic had already been accommodated along with his and Amon's characteristics. But why was there still another one? Was it one of the two that Amen sent back to Abraham after devouring Mr. Door? No, that's not right. As half of the Lord of the Mysteries, because it was only an initial accommodation, and he hadn't had time to digest it yet. As there was no threat, he could take his time. He could clearly recognize that this characteristic was identical to the one he had accommodated. An application of the Banach-Tarski paradox. As long as there's enough spirituality and it doesn't involve uniqueness or Sephira, I can replicate anything. Snow said calmly, beginning to activate open black lens bracket broken mirror, perfect reunion close black lens bracket. This characteristic had been accommodated by Amen for a very short time and hadn't been fully digested yet. There were still many mental imprints within it. When he was at sequence 1, this would obviously not be enough to form the foundation for resurrection, but now, Snow was already a true sequence above. As a massive amount of spirituality began to infuse, the Key of Stars characteristic also began to pulsate like a heart. In its orderly throbbing, root-like threads, like blood vessels, began to spread outwards from the key, and star worms, like fruit growing on a tree, emerged from the bifurcations of these blood vessels. They then crawled along the blood vessels towards the Key of Stars and clustered together, emitting a brilliant yet maddening starlight. Suddenly, the clouds in the sky abruptly dispersed, and even the black mist Snow used to shield the astral world's firmament was abruptly scattered. From the red moon that suddenly appeared, a sharp gaze seemed to cast itself here, as the Mother of Spirituality, the Mother Goddess of Depravity, had indeed left something connected to Mr. Door. However, Klein had already been waiting for a long time. In his eyes, layers of light doors with discordant scales emerged, and star worms clustered together within those light doors, like a winding and twisted, strange tentacle, about to emerge from his pupils. With just a glance, the gaze cast by the red moon was completely cut off. This was not some terrifying attack, but rather Klein, using the intersection of this gaze, had stolen the connection between the Mother Goddess of Depravity and Mr. Door. The gaze from the moon unwillingly retracted and lay dormant, and countless other observing gazes also retreated with it. Klein gently pinched his slightly swollen brow, then turned his head, only to see that the clusters of star worms had already reformed into a humanoid shape. Then, after a brief distortion and twitching, he became a middle-aged man with a stern face and black hair mixed with a small amount of white. He looked around at this somewhat unfamiliar land with a slight bewilderment, and his stern face also became a bit dazed. But soon, he heard a greeting that was enough to make him forget everything else. "Welcome home, Bethel Abraham." Watching Mr. Dorr depart, Klein's heart was suddenly filled with endless emotion and wistfulness. At this moment, he suddenly wanted to return to Backland to see Melissa and Benson. He had now become a quasi-outer deity, and no longer had to worry about anyone posing a danger to them. However, he had to first help Mr. Devil finish what he needed to do. Thinking of this, Klein eagerly said, "You said there were a few things earlier. What are the rest of them?" Snow heard this and waved his hand very casually, with an expression that said, "It's nothing much, it's not a big deal, really, just creating another Earth." "I see, another. What did you just say?" Klein's eyes suddenly widened, looking at Snow incredulously, but Snow said earnestly, "Another Earth. Didn't you see it before? As long as it doesn't involve uniqueness or Saphira, I can replicate anything. In fact, replicating a large ball of dirt is much easier than replicating a sequence one characteristic. What's the point of that? With you, me, and the awakened true creator, outer deities are no longer a concern. There's no need to build an immigrant ark, is there?" Klein scratched his head, hearing about replicating Earth. His first reaction was something like Noah's Ark. But Snow looked at him with a strange expression and said, "What are you thinking? I want to give modern people an independent home. After all, we can't let billions of people from modern society crowd onto one planet with the people of this era, can we? So what exactly do you want to do?" Listening to Snow's words, Klein felt a bit unwell. He stared at Snow with wide eyes, as if wanting to see what other astonishing words this gentleman could utter. "It's very simple. Resurrect all those people who suddenly died because of the Creator's initials at UPS. Can't you open the historical fog of that era? Transfer this authority to me, then I'll replicate the infrastructure, and then, through the residual aura of that era, just like resurrecting Mr. Dorr, I'll resurrect everyone. For them, there will be no apocalypse, just a moment of dazed. That way, you'll have two homes. Damn it, I'm a little envious, what should I do?" "Wait a minute, you mean, you can resurrect all the people who died in that era because of the apocalypse?" Klein suddenly grabbed Snow's shoulder, excitedly unlike an outer deity. Snow calmly nodded and said, "Didn't I say before that if you gave up, I could also send you back to the past, but this past isn't the true past but merely bringing all pasts to the present. Then what are we waiting for?" Upon hearing this, Klein, ignoring the fact that Snow had deceived him again, immediately transferred the authority of the historical fog to Snow. However, Snow shook his head and said, "Actually, there's still one problem." "What problem?" "I'm thinking about where to put that Earth. You wouldn't want those people to wake up and find that the cosmos and everything else are just textures, would you?" Chapter 606, The Tarot Club will continue. Monday, November 20th, 1352. After a week of cataclysmic changes, as if the world was ending yet new gods were constantly raising their divine kingdoms, the members of the Tarot Club had been in a state of worry and anxiety. Especially Leonard, to whom Klein had entrusted gold coins, and Alger, who had obtained the scepter of the sea god, both clearly sensed a feeling akin to making final arrangements. However, Mr. Fool had not announced a suspension of the Tarot Club, which offered everyone a bit of psychological comfort, but as the time drew nearer, a strong sense of unease settled in everyone's hearts. But finally, as the clock reached 3 p.m. Lowen time, the crimson light, like a tide, spread out as usual, enveloping every member of the Tarot Club, and then reforming new shapes above the gray fog. Is Mr. Devil not participating again? Audrey's first sight upon regaining consciousness was the empty seat. This gentleman had been absent for a long time, impersonating Adam in the forsaken land of the gods. Immediately, she looked at Mr. Fool with a hint of worry, intending to greet this great existence as usual, but her body suddenly froze. Because in her vision, the one sitting at the head of the bronze long table was not the familiar Mr. Fool from before. Although still covered by the gray fog, both the demeanor and sitting posture were vastly different from Mr. Fool. Soon, the Tarot Club members, who hadn't heard Miss Justice's greeting, also noticed the anomaly, and then, amidst everyone's shock and even fear, the man sitting at the head of the bronze long table pulled out a monocle from the void and placed it over his right eye. Interesting. Amen. Leonard almost sprang up from his high-backed chair, his hair bristling. He suddenly remembered that a long time ago, the old man had warned him to be careful if Mr. Fool's face ever had an extra monocle. A chill shot from the soles of his feet directly to the crown of his head. Not just Leonard, but almost everyone except Mr. World immediately became vigilant, though they also knew very well that above the gray fog, they simply couldn't contend with Amon. At the same time, however, a question arose in everyone's minds. Mr. World, why are you just sitting there? Have you really betrayed us? But in this tense and eerie atmosphere, a very familiar voice, gentle yet solemn and undeniable, came from the gray fog. This joke has gone a bit too far. Mr. Fool. Audrey cried out in surprise, then looked with a strange expression at the Amon wearing the monocle. He took off the monocle, casually sat down on an extra chair to the left of the head of the bronze long table, and said with a smile. Hello everyone, long time no see. Did you miss me, Mr. Devil? Audrey even wanted to rub her eyes vigorously, but after confirming that this style was indeed Mr. Devil, she couldn't help but puff out her cheeks. Mr. Devil, this isn't funny. The crisis instantly vanished, replaced by a strong sense of reassurance and a question. How exactly did Mr. Devil manage to get Mr. Fool to agree to such a prank? Hee. Snow scratched his head lightly, then looked at Klein, and then cleared his throat 2 times with a serious expression, saying with a smile. Sorry, I have an announcement everyone, I accidentally became a god. So, is anyone willing to switch allegiance? The Paradox Church is sincerely recruiting all kinds of priests, bishops, and pastors. Those with work experience are preferred, with top-tier industry benefits, comprehensive 5 insurances and 1 housing fund, and lenient doctrines. Quote. Hearing Mr. Devil speak of becoming a god in such a joking tone, everyone couldn't help but wonder if this was another prank. But seeing Mr. Fool, who had reseated himself in the main position, remain silent, they couldn't help but feel a sense of disillusionment. As Mr. Devil said, he has already become a god, and I have also completed my revival. Klein saw that the Tarot Club had fallen silent, and silently complained about Mr. Devil's bad taste before taking over the conversation, speaking in a slightly solemn voice. This should have been even more shocking than Mr. Devil becoming a god, but in the hearts of the Tarot Club members, this was both unexpected and within reason. So, when this news came from Mr. Fool's mouth, everyone was unexpectedly calm, only the foolish Moon hesitantly raised his hand and said, do we need to convert to Mr. Fool's church? You're feeling awkward because you realized you haven't converted, aren't you? The star Leonard secretly grumbled in his heart, but couldn't help but glance at Klein World. Seeing that he had no expression, he could only look at Mr. Fool. Hearing Moon's question, Klein chuckled, then shook his head and said, I said from the beginning that I wouldn't force any of you. I don't oppose those who wish to convert, nor will I force those who don't. In fact, Night, Earth, Machine, and the newly ascended Black Emperor, God of Luck, and God of Bound are all my allies. Whoosh. As the words fell, the companions with other faiths relaxed, their gazes then converged on Mr. Hanged Man, because they noticed that Mr. Fool had not mentioned the Storm Church. Of course, they didn't know that Mr. Hanged Man had already switched allegiance long before this. Soon there will be no more Storm Church. Leodoro will once again become the Wind Angel beside the true Creator, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom will also choose to descend in rank. Snow gave a somewhat unsettling answer. Considering the various bizarre celestial phenomena that had been occurring over the past week, and the strange omens that occasionally spread across the entire continent, everyone heard a strong scent of blood in this concise answer. For 2 of the most ancient, true gods to willingly descend in rank, many things must have happened. However, Mr. Hanged Man quickly reacted first. To avoid giving the signal that he still had lingering affection for the Storm Church, he immediately put aside his shock and respectfully asked, Respected Mr. Fool, will the Tarot Club continue? Hearing this question, Audrey and the others also perked up their ears. Even Furs, who was the most laid back, cast her gaze towards the head of the bronze long table. Although she was unwilling to admit it, she had a different kind of feeling towards Mr. World besides fear. Therefore, she did not wish for the connection of the Tarot Club to be severed. Klein smiled at the words. His gaze swept over every member of the Tarot Club, and he spoke. Of course, although the threat of the apocalypse has diminished, there are still many things to be wary of. The seal on the West Continent has loosened, and I hope you will contribute your strength. We obey your will. Alger was the first to rise, followed by the members of the Tarot Club who also stood up one by one, bowing to Klein. Meanwhile, Snow suddenly broke into a smile. While Klein wanted to stop him, but was constrained by the fool's gravitas and couldn't act, Snow pulled out a stack of exquisitely bound books and placed them into the hands of each Tarot Club member. Sun immediately felt a profound epic aura. He looked down to see a line of words written in gilded letters on the book. The Advent of the Fool, the Path of the Supreme Pillar. This is Mr. Fool's sacred text and gospel, which includes Mr. Fool's Awakening Record, the Gospels of Mr. Fool's Angels, Tarot Journey, About Us, and Acts of the Apostles, where we act on Mr. Fool's teachings. This will be recorded in Mr. Fool's sacred text, and it is also our glory. I will add them to the City of Silver's sacred texts. Son Derek nodded seriously, but time stopped at this very moment. Klein had fooled time, but as he reached out for the books, trying to steal all the embarrassing content within, the power of paradox covered them. Hee, little Joe, have you forgotten? Right now, you are only a quasi-outer deity, while I am a legitimate dual Sephira outer deity. Just wait for the Fool's sacred text to become the best-selling book on this planet. Don't do that. On the Sonia Sea, perpetually shrouded in mist, a pirate ship with a black hull and white trim cut through the waves. A skull flag with paradoxical heavy cupels flew high on the mast, announcing the ship's identity. The ship continuously tossed and fell between the giant waves, yet the pleasant sound of a zither was exceptionally melodious amidst the storm. The sound seemed to inspire all who heard it to embark on an adventure. In the dining room, two young men with black hair, brown eyes, yellowish skin, and soft features, seemingly with some elven ancestry, sat on either side of a bubbling red-hot pot, blanching various rare and common hot pot ingredients. The storm outside seemed to have no effect on the hot pot inside the cabin. Even as the ship was constantly tossed up and down, the steaming pot remained stable. Feng Shui glanced at Huang Dao, who had suddenly appeared to freeload food and drink, picked up a chopstick of tender lamb, blanched it in the pot, and then opened the conversation, saying, "By the way, didn't you go back to your hometown to visit relatives? Why are you here? Ah, don't even mention it." Huang Dao's expression immediately became a bit awkward when he heard Feng Shui's question, but he didn't avoid the topic. He just spread his hands and said, "Some things, you miss them when they're gone, but when you have them, you find them annoying. Although it was nice to see my parents again, I hadn't even stayed home for a few days before my mom started arranging blind dates for me. Bernadette is so grown up, and I can't very well ask her to pretend to be a child, so I introduced Nana to her grandparents. But that girl isn't close to me at all. My parents saw her and insisted I had abducted a child, almost calling the police. Seriously, I'm their son, their own son. They didn't even give me a chance to bring the child's mother. Actually, that makes sense. After all, Nana doesn't have household registration there. And who were you planning to bring as the child's mother? You can't mean a puppet, can you?" Feng Shui laughed heartlessly, stuffing the lamb dipped in sauce into his mouth. Just as he was about to say a few more sarcastic remarks, a figure suddenly appeared abruptly in the cabin. He also had an elven mixed blood appearance, but his face was slightly plump, and he was even younger. Seeing his sudden appearance, Feng Shui immediately said in surprise, "Why are you here too? Did your family also force you into a blind date?" "What blind date?" Zhou Mingrui was slightly taken aback by Huang Dao, then shook his head and threw a newspaper to Feng Shui, saying, "I came for this." With that, he casually pulled out a chair, sat at the table, and also began to eat. "Is there a problem?" Feng Shui glanced at the newspaper, saw that the year was 2018, and immediately understood that it was a newspaper from New Earth. Zhou Mingrui, hearing his question, immediately became a bit angry and said, "You're still asking me what happened? Look at the third page. Early this morning, NASA released a set of photos. They found a strange distortion in the photos transmitted by the astronomical telescope. Now the entire astronomical community on Earth is in an uproar. Is that all?" Feng Shui opened the newspaper, found the page Zhou Mingrui mentioned, and then said indifferently, "That's a gravity sphere for adjusting the solar system's gravity. I set up 6 of them in total. Without these things, how would the solar system's gravitational balance be maintained? You wouldn't think that just by creating a few satellites and having God Almighty create a sun, you could achieve the precise operation of the real Earth, would you? The sun created by God Almighty has light and heat, but it has no mass. Is that the problem?" Zhou Mingrui vigorously scratched his head. How could this thing be captured by an astronomical telescope? Nonsense. Mysticism is also a science, not true idealism. It will eventually intersect with reality. If gravity has a problem, it will naturally be observed. Can't you just fool them a bit? Feng Shui said a few perfunctory words, but seeing Zhou Mingrui's somewhat serious expression, he still sighed. It will be who knows how many years before Earthlings develop to explore beyond the solar system. When we capture the superstar overlord, we'll let him specifically create stars for New Earth to play with. That's the only way then. Zhou Mingrui shook his head, picked up a chopstick of tripe, and put it into his mouth. His previously tense expression immediately relaxed, and his eyes even squinted. That's right, don't be so stiff. Don't you feel bored staying at home all day? By the way, your sister asked me to introduce you to suitable blind date candidates with good family backgrounds. How about it, did you fancy anyone? Zhou Mingrui, who was enjoying the food, almost choked upon hearing this. He immediately glared and said, I haven't even talked about you yet. Melissa is one thing, but how could you join her in such nonsense? She doesn't know, but don't you? And what's with Elizabeth? You would even move her entire family to Backland. Lowen is your home. Zhou Mingrui complained in a resentful tone, but then suddenly stopped, because only then did he remember that Lowen was, in a sense, truly his home. Oh, I thought that little girl really liked you. After all, she cried terribly at your grave back then. Feng Shui's expression was as punchable as ever. Huang Dao, to Zhou Mingrui's right, immediately perked up and said, Oh, what happened? I thought this guy was a block of wood. Tell me more. Tell me more. Well, it all started when the great Mr. Fool awoke from his slumber and descended upon this tiny world. Back then, Feng Shui was halfway through his sentence when Zhou Mingrui immediately stole Feng Shui's thought of speaking, and at the same time, grafted his own thought of taking a deep breath onto him. Then, following the stolen thought of speaking, he said to Huang Dao, Never mind that, why are you here too? I thought he was the only one enjoying the fun of being a sea pianist here. Huang Dao also shook his head upon hearing this and said, My parents forced me to. By the way, how about you? How does it feel to be home? Looking at Huang Dao's fearful expression, Zhou Mingrui couldn't help but smile and also shook his head, saying, My family is fine, after all, I had only just graduated not long before I transmigrated. I can just use work to fob them off for a while, but I don't think I can fob them off for much longer. Why fob them off? Feng Shui suddenly interjected, Why don't you just make a Beander puppet, put on some makeup, and go back to meet the parents? It's not like you haven't cross-dressed before. No one would think you're mute if you didn't speak. Zhou Mingrui immediately bristled and cautiously glanced at Huang Dao. However, Huang Dao, who also had a playful side, surprisingly had no intention of exploring that topic, but instead turned his gaze to Feng Shui and said, Speaking of blind dates, son-in-law, when are you going back to get married? Bei Bei has been getting more and more irritable lately. When I went home earlier, Bonava was almost in tears. You were almost in tears, weren't you? Feng Shui rolled his eyes, but Zhou Mingrui exposed him, saying, I actually know a little about this. Before, Miss Justice, that's a member of my tarot club. She happened to run into Bernadette when she went to Feng Shui's family's ancient castle. As a result, all the spirit maids in his house called any beautiful woman, Madam, so you understand. You scoundrel, you already have Bei Bei, and you're still so unfaithful. Huang Dao's eyes immediately widened, and he glared fiercely at Feng Shui. Feng Shui just rolled his eyes and said, You're the least qualified to talk about me, and Audrey and I have absolutely no physical relationship. At this point, he suddenly turned to look at Zhou Mingrui, frowning, Speaking of which, how did you know about this? Of course, Miss Justice prayed to me. Zhou Mingrui said as a matter of course, but Feng Shui rolled his eyes. Stop spouting nonsense, Miss Justice wouldn't pray to you for something like this. And Bernadette didn't really do anything to her. I don't think just a brief exchange would make Miss Justice pray to the respected Mr. Fool. She didn't, but she muttered it in her heart. Zhou Mingrui mimicked Feng Shui's signature smile, which immediately made Feng Shui understand how those who had been subjected to his same smile felt. The three deities gathered around the hot pot, clinking glasses. The leisurely daily life of deities seemed no different from that of mortals. In the northwest of East Chester County, at the confluence of York Mountain and the Hoy River, a black castle stood in a verdant valley. It was neither towering nor majestic, nor grand and imposing, it simply possessed an artistic flair and a comfortable, refined beauty that seemed out of step with the times. Around the castle, there were flat, bluestone paved roads, and neat, uniform lawns spread out on either side. On both flanks of the castle, there were meticulously maintained orchards and farmlands. However, what was noteworthy was that these crops were not tended by tenants or servants, but by tiny fairies, no bigger than a palm, with butterfly-like wings. If there was any flaw, it was that its roads were too narrow. While clearly fine for walking, they were definitely not wide enough for carriages to pass normally, which seemed quite fatal for a noble estate. However, for this castle, this did not seem to be an issue. As afternoon approached, a sudden ball of light rose from the cracks in the bluestone path, coalescing into a simple door in the air. The door slowly opened, and a young girl stepped out, looking with some novelty at the exquisite castle before her. However, this observation did not last long. She followed the path to the large black door and gently knocked on the knocker, which was carved with a beast's head biting it. A clear and penetrating sound emanated from the knocking. Soon, with the atmospheric creak of the large door, what appeared before the girl were maids lined up in 2 rows, and a slightly older butler with a gentle smile and an impeccable demeanor. "Welcome, madam. I'm here for the tea party. This is the invitation." The girl seemed a bit nervous. After a moment of hesitation, she took out an invitation and handed it to the butler. The butler respectfully accepted the invitation, then nodded and said, "Please follow me. The other ladies are already waiting in the garden." "All right." A hint of shame flickered across the girl's face, but she immediately followed. Passing through a not so spacious but not dark or cramped corridor, the girl was led by the butler to the back garden. At this time, many people were already seated around the round table in the center of the garden. Seeing the girl arrive, one lady in a ruffled skirt immediately said, "I told you. Zio is definitely going to arrive right on time. Furs. The Loan custom is to be 5 minutes late, and I'm on time." Zio said discontentedly, though she still felt a bit guilty as she walked over. Then she looked at Audrey, who was hosting today's tea party, and said, "Miss Justice, is it all right for us to hold a tea party at Mr. Devil's house?" "It's fine. I have permission to use this castle, and the invitations I sent you were signed with it. Also, just call me Audrey." Audrey showed off the castle key she always wore on her waist, which looked more like a decoration than a key, with a hint of pride. Then she fanned herself and said, "Everyone's here, let's begin." "Okay, meow." Lily immediately got up to prepare tea. Audrey looked rather embarrassed and immediately said, "Sit down, Maria can do it." "But aren't we going to discuss the topic of having babies? Wouldn't it be inappropriate for Maria and them to hear?" Lily tilted her head, delivering the lines of a social terrorist without any qualms. Hearing her words, even the usually stern Sharon couldn't help but stiffen, frowning as she corrected her. "It's about dating." Exactly. "And it's not even my problem. I was just dragged here by furs." Zio, who had just sat down, also muttered softly. Lily, however, said indifferently, "Isn't dating just for having babies? Quote. All right, if you want to prepare, then prepare." Audrey, defeated by Lily's social terrorist tendencies and unable to use her instant fainting spell as the host of the tea party, could only compromise, watching Lily happily brew and pour tea. Ahem, in any case, there are no gentlemen here, so everyone can speak freely. With Zio as an arbiter, no one will spread what they hear. As a lady who had received a full education in noble etiquette, Audrey quickly recovered from the atmosphere disrupted by Lily and delivered her opening remarks for the day. The ladies around the round table exchanged glances, but for some reason, no one spoke first. However, soon, Melissa, who had also been invited by Audrey to make up the numbers, suddenly spoke, breaking the ice. "I don't have any problems myself, but it's mainly my second brother. He's completely unconcerned. My eldest brother is already married, but he doesn't even have a girlfriend. I kindly arranged something for him, but he ran off to who knows where. Look on the bright side, maybe he actually has someone he likes, and you just don't know about it." Zio heard Melissa's words and sighed with a touch of emotion. "As long as he's not like my brother." "Your brother? Isn't he a trainee lawyer at a law firm? And I've never heard you mention him." Furs looked at Zio with some surprise. Usually, if her best friend had any worries, wouldn't she tell her? "Of course you haven't heard me mention him. You haven't even been back to Backland for the past 2 months, have you?" Zio rolled her eyes at Furs, but Furs just scratched her cheek, wearing an expression that said, "I was out gathering material." Seeing her like this, Zio didn't say much more, pulling the conversation back to her troublesome younger brother. "It has nothing to do with work. The main thing is that he's been getting too close to Sherman recently." "Sherman, I remember she's a hostess at that bar in the East Borough, right? She has a very good personality, and she's well liked. She's not one of those streetwalkers. You're not going to look down on her because she's from a poor background, are you?" Furs, unaware of the truth, cast a suspicious glance, and the attention of the others immediately focused on her. Although at this point, with the exception of Melissa, a Sequence 6 artisan, everyone else was at least a demigod, human nature still made them eager for gossip. "How could I? I was poor once, okay. If it's just her background, that's not a problem at all. The problem is, Sherman, he's a man," Zio said, collapsing, and angrily took a pastry from the dessert stand. She munched on it like a hamster, crunching twice, finally calming her emotions with the delicious treat. "A man? No, that's not right. I've seen her, she's definitely, wait, do you mean, a demoness? Furs finally reacted, but Zio shook her head vigorously. If she were just a demoness, I'd accept it. After all, we used to be friends, and she's the type whose gender identity was always female from the start. But the problem is, he can switch between two genders. How is that possible? Is he a high-sequence seer? Edwina, who had originally been listening to it as ordinary gossip, immediately became interested. Based on the knowledge she possessed, among the currently known sequences, it seemed only a seer could truly change their gender status. It's a stand, meow. Lily, gnawing on a dried fish, let out a cute tail sound and pointed to herself. Just like I can turn back into a cat, Sherman's stand is to turn into a woman. Perhaps the juicy gossip about her own brother that she had blurted out had opened up the conversation, and the ladies were no longer as reserved as before. Ms. Audrey, in particular, fulfilled her duty as a spectator. After a brief interpretation of the ladies' tolerance for the topic, she took a sip of black tea, using the action to lower everyone's guard, and then said, speaking of which, what kind of gentlemen do you all like? This question seemed a bit direct, but for a tea party attended only by women, it was a very traditional opening topic. After a very brief silence, Melissa tentatively said, I prefer someone with strong practical skills, preferably with some proficiency in machine. At this point, Melissa suddenly felt everyone looking at her strangely, and immediately blushed as she explained, after all, common interests are very important. That's true, but what about personality? You might not care about money or status when choosing a partner, but character and personality are still very important, aren't they? Furs rubbed her head, starting to doubt if coming to this tea party was the right decision. Personality, someone who's family-oriented. Melissa hesitated for a moment before continuing, preferably someone who's good at managing a household, because I'm not very good at that. It seems your romantic life, Melissa, might be quite troublesome. Furs gave a rather subtle assessment, and Melissa immediately frowned. Then what about you, Ms. Furs? What kind of gentleman do you like? Furs regretted speaking just now, but the topic was already on her lips, and she had originally intended to gather some information anyway, so she immediately said, as for me, I prefer the type that looks a bit scholarly, wears glasses but has fierce eyes. It's best if he's also very powerful, good at making money, and kind-hearted. It would be even better if he didn't force me to write books. So Furs likes Mr. World. And the German Sparrow version, she actually likes that fierce type. Audrey realized she had discovered a secret, but immediately hid her expression, because she noticed that after hearing Furs's description, Edwina's muscles seemed to tense up. She was on guard. Speaking of which, the legends about German Sparrow at sea. Audrey gently covered her chin with a fan, then looked at Edwina. Although she felt a bit sorry for Furs, she was also very curious. Thinking this, she said, Ms. Edwina, what about you? Me. Edwina tilted her head slightly, seemingly reluctant to speak, but Katlia next to her smiled and said, she doesn't lack for men. Every single person on the Golden Dream is her supporter. Wow. Melissa immediately widened her eyes. Is this what pirates are like? Gaze falling upon Edwina. Feeling the lady's gaze, Edwina's spiritual intuition told her there was some danger, so she immediately said, that's just their wishful thinking. In reality, I don't have much interest in romantic relationships. If I had to find a partner, I would hope for someone learned, with a rich foundation of knowledge, who could discuss various topics with me, but not like those pedants from the Church of Knowledge. He shouldn't be too rigid, and ideally, he should have some adventurous spirit. Indeed. Mr. World, you truly are a sinful man. Audrey curbed her desire to clutch her heart and secretly glanced at Melissa, only to find that she didn't seem to be making the connection. But that's right, how could a normal person connect a crazy adventurer with a gentle history student? Audrey had the thought of discovering a secret, but then a flash of inspiration crossed her mind. She realized with some helplessness that Mr. Devil seemed to fit these criteria too. Oh, heavens. Audrey, you already have a king of angels as a rival in love, you can't have another enemy. I must guide her towards Mr. World. Furs, I'm sorry. Audrey's mind raced through a myriad of thoughts in an instant, then she shifted her gaze to the left, looking at Ms. Sharon, who had remained still like a doll. Sharon noticed Audrey's gaze and didn't particularly resist. Although she was a member of the Temperance faction, since she had come to this tea party, it wasn't to remain silent. She tilted her head slightly, then said in a cool and calm tone, proactive, decisive, brave, grateful, full of justice, able to control one's desires. After spitting out several keywords in a row, Ms. Sharon suddenly paused, a faint blush appearing on her cheeks, then quickly vanishing. Finally, she uttered a few more words. And a gentle heart. Ms. Sharon's criteria for a partner, my second brother meets them all. How about I arrange for you two to meet? Melissa's eyes immediately lit up as she listened to Sharon's words. Sharon smiled and nodded gently, saying, that's fine. In fact, this was the fundamental reason Sharon attended this tea party. To say these words, she had worked very hard to indulge her emotions. Ah, a decisive move. Ms. Sharon is making a move. Why aren't Furs and Edwina reacting at all? Audrey's mouth opened slightly, then she suddenly remembered that neither Furs nor Edwina seemed to know that Klein, Sherlock, and Gehrman were the same person. Mr. World, your sins have deepened. Should I talk to him about this at the next tarot club? But I've already promised that nothing from the tea party can be revealed. Ah, this is truly a dilemma. Audrey put down her teacup. Lily immediately refilled it, then somewhat boisterously said, Meow is very simple, Meow likes master, Cough cough. Several ladies simultaneously burst into violent coughs, forcibly interrupting Lily's attempt to lead the topic into everyone's blind spot. To suppress this chaotic presence that had infiltrated a group of single ladies, Melissa, in a panic, blurted out, Ms. Audrey, what about you? What are your criteria for a partner? Me, huh? Audrey hadn't fully recovered from Lily's shocking statement when she heard the fire being directed at her. However, she had already prepared her thoughts, and shaking her head, she said, after I became a spectator, I originally thought I wouldn't be able to genuinely like anyone anymore. After all, I can see through people's hidden things, all their flaws and lies are magnified in my eyes. And I am still very naive now, I haven't learned to appreciate others' flaws. So Ms. Audrey likes men who have a sense of mystery, who can't be seen through. But such men are also very dangerous. Furs suddenly had new inspiration for a book, a rich young lady who can read hearts and a mysterious, dangerous criminal. Besides romance, she could also add a detective plot, it would definitely be a bestseller. Thinking this, Furs suddenly shook her head again. She had just returned from her teacher and wanted to rest for a few more days. She could just jot down this inspiration for now. Audrey didn't know that in the short span of a sentence, Furs had once again announced her intention to slack off. She gently shook her head and said, of course, it can't just be mystery. Although it's a bit contradictory, it's best if I know him somewhat, and he also needs to provide a sense of security. It would also be best if he were a bit more romantic. At this point, Lily suddenly stretched her head to the center of the table, then looked at Audrey at a somewhat distorted angle. After sizing her up, she said with a serious air, so you like Master, Meow. Ah, Lily, what are you saying? Audrey immediately refuted, blushing, but then felt that it seemed a bit too obvious. She forcibly curbed her reaction, even using a lie to apply a layer of makeup to herself, concealing her crimson cheeks. However, having stepped out of her spectator state, she didn't notice the subtle expression that appeared on the face of a certain lady attending the meeting. As a sequence 3 of the spectator pathway, Audrey quickly regained her composure, showing an elegant yet polite social smile, taking a sip of red tea, and then, adjusting her mindset, said, speaking of which, I actually have no experience with romance. Do any of you have experience in that area? Whoosh. Although they weren't particularly familiar with each other, everyone's gaze instantly turned to Edwina because of Katlia's earlier remark. Being the focus of such attention, Edwina felt a little helpless, but having been surrounded by a group of admirers who thought they were well hidden for many years, she wasn't shy about this attention. Instead, she shook her head and said, I don't think one-sided admiration counts as romance, otherwise, you certainly wouldn't lack such experience. That's true, but you seem to be from the Church of Knowledge, right? Did you not have those more lively male classmates when you were in school? Furs, a veteran romance novel author, asked curiously, seemingly wanting to probe this suspected love rivals, romantic life and, incidentally, collect some material on the pirate general, now the pirate king. However, to everyone's surprise, the moment Furs asked this question, Edwina's intellectual and refined face suddenly became a little distorted, but anyone who saw it could clearly interpret the meaning behind that expression. Disgust. Extreme disgust. Gossip. Audrey immediately judged that there must be a story here and immediately said with intentionally distorted words. Is the atmosphere at the Church of Knowledge's school very bad? I heard that the education there is the best on the entire continent. It's not a problem with the church school. Edwina gently shook her head. Although she could tell this might be a spectator's verbal trap, she didn't think it was something that couldn't be said. She explained in a still somewhat disgusted tone. The Church of Knowledge, or rather, Lindbergh, is completely different from other countries. There, neither the royal family, nobles, nor merchants are important, what's important is knowledge. There's an assessment within the church, and depending on the score, one receives different treatment. So, in the schools in Lindbergh, there isn't much interaction between students. Everyone's goal is to study hard, get higher scores, and thus gain more resources and fame. That level shouldn't make you feel disgusted, right? Zio chimed in, and Edwina nodded. That's right, I actually quite like that atmosphere, but there was an annoying guy in my class. Besides painting, he failed every other exam, yet he loved to bother me, which once caused me to only get second place in several exams. But thankfully, he was later expelled from school. Only got second place. Seeing that Edwina didn't seem to be joking when she said that, everyone tacitly changed the subject, and Zio, who had just chimed in, inevitably became the center of attention. Quote. Zio felt everyone's gazes and knew she probably couldn't escape. To hear gossip, one naturally had to be prepared to reveal some of their own. She took a slight breath and said, I do have some experience in that area. Before she could finish speaking, Furs let out an extremely loud gasp, then, with very exaggerated body language, grabbed Zio's shoulders and shook her vigorously. When did you start dating? Why didn't I know? Who is he? Do I know him? Is it Lavish from the workers' movement? Or Gianna from Enthusiasm? Or, listening to Furs list various male names with whom she had interacted, Zio's expression became somewhat unpleasant, and she immediately said, No shouting allowed here. Click. Furs's words were forcibly interrupted, and Zio immediately lifted the decree, then helplessly wiped away non-existent sweat beads, sighing. When I was still a noble lady a few years ago, I had a few social relationships. The men were all descendants of the Loan military and royal faction at the time, but after my father had an accident, we lost contact. I'm sorry. Furs realized she had reopened her best friend's wound and immediately apologized, but Zio just shook her head and said, I stopped caring a long time ago, otherwise I wouldn't bring it up. Besides, they also provided some help when my family fell on hard times. Oh. Audrey saw that Zio wasn't putting on a brave face and understood that her good friend had indeed moved past the shadow. She immediately smiled and said, Then have you considered rekindling old flames? Let's not. Zio shook her head. I don't mind resuming a friendship with them, and in fact, I have. But my horizons have changed during this time, and I can no longer like those flashy noble scions from my old circle. If I had to choose now, it would ideally be a Beander with considerable strength, someone with a strong sense of responsibility, but who also understands how to endure and make sacrifices. Oh, then what do you think of my second brother? He's a major general now, and he's also of the Arbiter pathway. Audrey remembered Alfred, who had just returned home, and immediately introduced him to Zio, but then added mentally, although he can't beat Susie. Zio was slightly stunned by the remark, then rejected it using the most tactful language possible. I'm not in a hurry regarding this. After all, I'm already a demigod, and time is abundant. As for Mr. Alfred, our interactions should be frequent enough, so we'll let nature take its course. All right then. Audrey nodded, but inwardly, she breathed a sigh of relief. From Zio's attitude, she shouldn't have any romantic feelings for Mr. Devil. Looking at it this way, it seems relatively safe. There's also Miss Hermit to be wary of. Although she had been speaking the whole time, she hadn't revealed any secrets about herself. She almost slipped past me. Audrey thought of this, and after Melissa's comment, my family didn't have the means for me to date back then, she turned her gaze to Katlia, beginning to ponder how to induce her to speak. But just then, a figure suddenly walked into the passage not far from the garden. Almost simultaneously, everyone stopped their conversation, but as they turned around, they saw a lady gracefully approaching. Your Highness, Queen Mystic. Audrey immediately became nervous and simultaneously cast her gaze towards Lily. Lily, startled by Audrey's look, immediately said, No, I didn't snitch. It has nothing to do with Lily. I just heard you were having a tea party when I came home, so I came to take a look. You can just call me Bernadette. Oh, and I'm very interested in topics of romance. Do you mind including me? As the King of Angels took her seat, the atmosphere in the air became heavy for a moment. However, Bernadette was not there to cause trouble. As she picked up her teacup, a tranquil fragrance emanated from her, and a calming and relaxing scent, accompanied by the blooming of beautiful small flowers, filled the entire garden. For a moment, everyone even forgot the pressure brought by their sequence. Audrey, seeing Bernadette instantly alleviate the tense atmosphere, not to be outdone, cast a mental pacification to help everyone relax. Bernadette then took the opportunity to restart the conversation. Speaking of love, how about we talk about how you met him? What do you say, Audrey? Although Bernadette's tone was gentle, Audrey felt a strong sense of challenge. She opened the folding fan Snow had given her. The image of a silver-white dragon soaring covered her slightly puffed cheeks, but on the side facing her, a line of words appeared. Challenge accepted. Audrey rose slightly, placed one hand on her chest, and spoke in a melodious and clear voice. Since I was a child, I understood one thing: my words and actions must uphold the dignity of a noble. Regarding marriage, love is not important, family interests are the issues that must be considered. When I stepped into Buridan, I discovered a problem: all lies and all secrets were laid bare. After realizing this, I felt it would be difficult for me to enjoy love because I still couldn't appreciate others' flaws. Should I accept reality? Accept a certain prince? Of course not. I told myself I needed to learn to wait. I worked hard to advance my sequence, to control my own destiny, and then I realized I had already fallen for him. Fortunately, I met him. He is handsome, he is knowledgeable, and he possesses unfathomable secrets. That inscrutable expression is deeply captivating. Sometimes he is clumsy, yet overly clever. I could have won him over much earlier, but I hesitated because of my family. Alas, thinking back now, I really missed the best opportunity. Listening to Audrey's narration, Melissa said with great emotion. Exactly, Elizabeth said the same thing. She is very regretful of her hesitation back then. Audrey nodded vigorously, clenching her small fist and saying, so I knew I had to do something. After all, if this continues, we will only drift further apart. This is a problem all people with crushes must face. Exactly. Furs nodded emphatically. That's right. Edwina deeply understood. If I get another chance, I must seize it. X2. Edwina and Furs said in unison, then suddenly realizing something, their gazes immediately met. Seeing this, Audrey immediately stepped forward, positioning herself between the two. Guessing his thoughts, chasing his traces, although it's a bit unlike me, I don't want to give up. Perhaps you think I'm a bit extreme, but this is the love I want to pursue. At this point, Audrey gave Bernadette a meaningful look, then scanned the surroundings and said, do you think it's wrong to change yourself for the sake of love? Oh, of course not. Sharon shook her head, looking thoughtfully at Edwina and Furs who were staring at each other, and uncharacteristically spoke up. Love, even for someone as restrained as me, is irresistible. Saying that, she walked between Audrey and Bernadette, as if deliberately imitating Audrey, and said, I never thought about love, life kept me too busy. The endless pursuits were practically killing me. But one day I met a strange person. Even when his life was hanging by a thread, he could face it optimistically. His strength was weak, but he was very confident. As a detective, he could evade assassination and still take on jobs to earn money. When Sharon said this, she suddenly showed a doll-like exquisite smile, looked at Melissa and winked. Busting infidelity, oh, wow. Melissa, connecting this to Miss Sharon's decisive agreement to a blind date earlier, instantly understood. She gasped in surprise, while also feeling a little sorry for Elizabeth. However, Sharon did not continue to hint, but instead placed one hand on her chest. I protected him, and he helped me. After resolving the crisis, I started to care about him. Although I was being hunted, I didn't flee. Instead, I tried to ask him for help and take a gamble. Oh, thinking back now, I might have truly been a lunatic, actually letting a Sequence 7 join a dispute where a demigod might appear. Sharon put one hand on her forehead, seemingly recalling her irrationality at the time, but then a beautiful smile appeared on her face again. It turns out I was quite lucky. His strength and wisdom were good, and he had external help. A little help, a little secret, this built a good relationship between us. His personality is gentle, and he is very nostalgic. Even when facing a desperate situation, he would come to see me. I have no doubt that I chose the right path. His gentleness is enough to make me no longer restrained. Having said so much in one breath, Sharon let out a gasp that a demigod shouldn't make. However, she still looked at Melissa with a slightly flushed face, and in her sparkling eyes, she was sure her confession had been received by her sister-in-law. Klein actually has such a side. Melissa's heart was slightly curious, because she knew Klein had been having a hard time lately, so she hadn't specifically inquired about her brother's experiences. But now, it seemed there was a need to ask about it. I wish I had been as decisive as you back then. Edwina sighed thoughtfully, while Furs shook her head and said, I don't think he's someone who can be moved in that way. Well, actually, I was just scaring myself. Who says? I was also held back by his stern exterior at the time. In fact, if I had thought about it carefully then, I should have known, how could such a knowledgeable person be a lunatic? Watching her two love rivals being outshone by the third and still sighing at each other, Bernadette gently shook her head. Then she met Audrey's gaze, smiled slightly, and then, imitating her, said, "When I met him, he was still very weak, seeing me like a mouse seeing a cat. But I keenly sensed that he might know me, and fortunately, my intuition was accurate enough. I approached him with a firm attitude, asking all sorts of questions and looking for solutions. My resolve is strong, so I never thought of giving up. And the answers he gave were satisfactory enough for me. He is mysterious, he is bold, but most importantly, he and I have enough in common. Being with him, I feel very comfortable. It's a wonderful experience I haven't had in 100 years. Perhaps when I say this, you might not quite understand. After all, that's the feeling one gets when meeting a kindred spirit alone. I gave him some rewards, getting what I wanted, but later I found out that what I really wanted was him. Love, perhaps, but I cannot say it. At least until my goal is achieved, we must be very pure. I thought about using him, and also tried to exchange things of equal value, otherwise the feelings would surely end before they even began. Perhaps you have heard this saying, love and wisdom, the two cannot be had at the same time. To maintain rationality, I rarely showed emotion, and only now do I realize I might have been wrong. Whoever loves by rules will not get love. Hugh looked bewildered at the tea party, which had turned into a musical and was gradually becoming more confrontational, and suddenly wondered if she had misunderstood. Perhaps today's tea party theme is a musical. Inside an ancient castle hidden in the forest outside Stone City in East Chester County, the desolate mansion, which had been quiet for 1,000 years, was now bustling with activity once again. After the bloodline curse disappeared and the ancestral relics were returned, the remaining few members of the Abraham family who hoped to welcome back their ancestor finally sided with the fool. Thus, the family reassembled from all over the world, returning to this 1,000-year-old, ancient and solemn mansion passed down by their ancestor. Door, I'm here. What can I do for you? Hearing the call, the young man of the Abraham family named Dor immediately looked up at the man in front of him, who had graying temples but a remarkably youthful face. After the bloodline curse disappeared, the Abraham family experienced a surge in promotions. Many members who had been stuck at Sequence 5 due to the curse began to advance to demigod in batches with a picture frame. The ritual was easily completed, and many low-sequence clansmen also saw improvements. The man before him, Benjamin Abraham, was an Abraham clansman active 200 years ago, who once served Rosal Gustav. Later, he died of old age because he could not advance to demigod. After Rosal Gustav's return and ascension to the Black Emperor, this trusted subject of his was also resurrected and became one of the 12 spokesmen of the Abraham family. Your bloodline has been verified. Congratulations on rejoining the family. Benjamin showed a faint smile. Perhaps because of those difficult times, the Abraham family did not have the strict hierarchy of other Beander families. Even the family's spokesmen were quite amiable when facing a newly recognized clansman. Thank you very much. Dor's face showed a sincere smile, but Benjamin shook his head and said, "There's nothing to thank me for. As long as you are an Abraham, you are a member of the family. Come, I'll take you to meet the others." Okay. Dor immediately followed, a special glint in his eyes. In reality, he was not an orphan of the Abraham family lost to the outside world, nor was he one of those impostors who heard the news and came to claim kinship. His true identity was the King of Angels, the ancestor of the Abraham family, Bethel Abraham, who had only recently been resurrected. However, this gentleman showed some hesitation when facing the home he had longed for, because he didn't know how to face these clansmen. 1,000 years had passed, and most of his old friends were gone. The familiar juniors in the family had long since lost control and died under his full moon murmurs. He felt deep down that he owed this family, but he did not regret the choice he had made. In the end, he did not reveal his identity, nor did he hide his name. Instead, he returned to his home as a distant descendant of a collateral branch of the Abraham family. Although it was a bit strange to be a junior to his own descendants, Bethel, who had been away from home for many years, no longer cared about such things. Watching the young people greet him one by one, he felt that such a life seemed pretty good. On the Sonia Sea, a huge single-masted sailboat sailed on the calm sea, with wisps of mist following it. This was the legendary Ghost Empire, the current seat of the newly crowned pirate king, the Night Emperor. Wearing a black tuxedo with gold embroidery, the Night Emperor, Truncest, stood in the center of the city-sized deck, directing his subjects and ghost ship crew to build an altar. In the center of the altar, a scarlet teardrop-shaped gem pulsed and expanded like a heart. Threads of blood emerged from the deck's cracks, coiling around the gem without touching it. In a peculiar rhythm, the Night Emperor spread his hands, and an illusory book of edicts slowly unfolded. As lines of edicts were written, the former residents of Nadipu town and the adventurers trapped on the ship, forced to become sailors, reluctantly walked to the altar, slit their wrists, and let their blood drip into the altar. Thank you, source of life. Praise you, mother of all things. As Truncest chanted the honorific name of the Earth Mother, threads of blood began to weave into an exquisite cocoon. Although the original ritual should have chanted the honorific name of the sanguine progenitor, the primordial moon had now been contaminated by something, and the Night Emperor could only settle for the next best thing. However, the intelligence that the two were one was no longer a secret among high-sequence beyonders, and he also believed that this mother would not refuse to grant him the power to complete this ritual. Indeed, the moon's light pierced through layers of mist, scattering above the empty altar. Blood threads and blood converged, solidifying into a ruby-like shell. Truncest waved his hand, signaling the crew to leave, then stood silently before the bloody gem, maintaining the altar's operation. Crack, crack, crisp cracking sounds emanated from the ruby-like cocoon. Cracks spread across the cocoon. A fair and slender arm suddenly reached out from within, slowly pushing open the outer shell. Moments later, a flawless body emerged from the blood cocoon. She gently gathered her long hair that reached her waist. The shattered gem cocoon fragments, after a slight wriggle, transformed into a blood-red gown that covered her body. My dear, this doesn't seem to be the initially chosen plan. Ornia surveyed her surroundings, frowning slightly. Even without the Beander characteristic of beauty goddess, she was still the most beautiful being in this world. No choice, I ran into Aemon when I was resurrected. Truncest hadn't finished speaking when Onyxia showed a look of realization, nodding and saying. Understood. You were tricked again. Quote, comma, quote. Quote, comma, quote. The atmosphere on the deck was a bit awkward for a moment. After a brief silence, Truncest sighed. There's a new Black Emperor now, and the God of Bound and God of Luck have already become gods. The true creator has returned to his peak state. All right, Mother has already told me. Onyxia reached out to stop the Night Emperor's statement, which was on the verge of tears, and said with a hint of comfort. How about this, you come back to the clan with me? No. Truncest shook his head vigorously. Are you kidding? When Onyxia married him back then, it was a step up for her. But now, going back to the Sanguine with her, what's the difference from going back as a live-in son-in-law? He was the dignified Night Emperor, a former justiciar true god. How could he go back and live off a woman? Then what do you plan to do? Although only one of the three hands of order has an owner, the uniqueness is in the hands of someone above sequence. Onyxia sorted through the knowledge passed down to her by the progenitor, sighing helplessly. Upon hearing this, the Night Emperor's expression immediately deflated, but he still said somewhat stubbornly. At least I can't go back just like this. I still have a good amount of Beander characteristic reserves here. Once I establish a maritime kingdom again, then we can talk about other things. Onyxia looked at Truncest's stubborn expression, and finally showed a helpless smile. Never mind, let him be. A man's strange pride sometimes needs to be indulged. Repeat, this contains a lot of lore. Do not subscribe if you are not interested in lore and world building. Following the previous faith revolution, the beliefs on the northern continent and southern continent gradually stabilized. After a series of relatively peaceful negotiations, the faiths across this land were redivided. With the two great churches of Storm and Wisdom announcing their joining the Church of Light, and the two, most ancient, deities becoming subordinate gods to the Creator worshipped by the Church of Light, the newly recognized true God churches no longer seemed so prominent. The Faesac Empire has now completed its revolution, becoming the Faesac Federation, led by the workers' movement. In this nation that champions combat and passion, after the Church of the God of War was replaced by the Night Church, the primary faith is now the newly established God of Combat, while the second largest is the all-embracing Church, which supports the workers' movement and believes in the God of Paradox. Intis, which also just completed its revolution, is currently under the co-governance of the three great churches, though the structure here is more precise and detailed. As the most widespread faith, the god of machinery of the Steam and Machinery Church has been renamed the Goddess of Machine and announced as the wife of Black Emperor, Rosal Gustav. However, Black Emperor Rosal, the symbol of earthly imperial power, did not change Intis's current federal system, instead decentralizing authority and renaming the church the Law and Order Church. The third church in Intis is the Church of Light, which led the Intis Revolution. It is worth noting that unlike Faesac's faith model, which is primarily God of Combat, supplemented by the all-embracing Church and the Night Church, Intis's faith structure emphasizes clear division of labor. Most commoners believe in the Church of Light, which worships the Creator as its main deity, while technical professionals believe in the God of Steam and Machinery. Politicians, lawyers, and literary creators mostly follow the Law and Order Church. Of course, there are also some less orthodox inventors who worship Emperor Rosal more. Compared to these two veteran-strong nations, Loan, also a seasoned power, has had an intricate religious environment for years, which has now become even more diverse. The main faith here is the Evernight goddess, but there are also many churches of the all-embracing church and the Fool. Although within the country, people prefer the Evernight goddess, in the Sonia Sea and the southern continent colonies, the populace mostly believes in the Fool and Paradox. There are also many churches of the god of steam and machinery and the Earth Mother, but most of their followers are professionals in related fields. Additionally, in Loan, there is an emerging religion called the Church of Fate. This church is dedicated to interpreting and organizing fate. Its churches are less places of worship and more gathering places for mystery enthusiasts. The god of luck of the Church of Fate is a subordinate deity of the Great Fool. He was granted the authority of luck by the Fool, protecting professions such as seer and seafarer. Of course, there are also some less serious individuals who are willing to believe in the god of luck, but these less devout gamblers rarely receive the luck they desire. Compared to these three veteran powers, the newly established Limburg Empire appears somewhat peculiar. The main faith here is the Church of Light, but unlike the Lord of Storms, who only has one main cathedral on Passu Island and is otherwise only worshipped in side altars of the Church of Light, the god of knowledge and wisdom has retained a significant number of churches here. This is seen as a compromise made by the Church of Light to counterbalance the all-embracing church. Although the authorities have never confirmed this, the revered names of the two deities, Paradox and Knowledge, are enough to show their animosity. Compared to the four increasingly powerful nations, Fenaport, a veteran but now weakened power, can be considered the Earth Mother's exclusive territory. It boasts the world's most advanced agriculture and medical systems. Interestingly, the Earth Mother, who even rejects the Church of Light, allows the Night Church to preach and has also granted preaching permission to another new church. The Church of the Suffering God. This emerging religion believes in a deity called the Suffering God. It is said that he is the rebellious son of Emperor Rosal, ostracized because he was not born of the goddess of steam and machine, and unable to establish a church in Intis. Some even suspect, due to the Earth Mother's actions, that this suffering god is the illegitimate daughter of the Earth Mother and Emperor Rosal. Of course, anyone who dares to publicly spread such rumors has ended up in the basement of the Earth Mother Church. It is worth mentioning that the Church of the Suffering God protects all who suffer, including the disabled, beggars, and elderly who cannot care for themselves. This means the church receives almost no donations, instead spending large sums of money each year to aid these believers. Such a business model would certainly not last long, but the Church of the Suffering God has maintained this approach since its inception. It is said that the Church of the Suffering God has long received funding from the Law and Order Church. Its doctrine advocates temperance and compassion, yet it has a strange festival called Faith Holiday, which allows believers one day of faith vacation each month, during which they do not have to adhere to the doctrine of temperance. Evidently, ordinary people would not believe in such a strange religion, but relatively, its followers are also the most devout among all churches. In fact, the main stronghold of the Church of the Suffering God is not the developed northern continent, but the southern continent, which serves as a colony. These 10 great churches collectively control the faith of this land, yet they are no longer overtly hostile to each other as before. Some idle scholars, who fancy themselves theologians, have compiled the genealogies of these churches in their spare time and created a widely accepted pantheon chart. Firstly, there is the oldest pantheon of the Creator. After the mutually hostile Eternal Blazing Sun Church was completely suppressed, the Church of Light now stands at the pinnacle of this world. Not to mention the Creator and the two deities, Storm and Knowledge, who have been demoted to subordinate gods. Even the most influential god of combat in Fosak is his subject. Next is the Gustav Pantheon, with clear historical support, with Black Emperor Rosal as the chief deity, the goddess of steam and machine as the divine empress, and flanked by two angels, Bonava Gustav and Bernadette Gustav. There are even rumors that the god of paradox is Emperor Rosal's son-in-law. Emperor Rosal's journey as the son of steam, a great writer, inventor, and politician, cultivated and supported by the goddess of steam and machine, eventually becoming her consort, is also a popular topic of discussion. Then there is the double goddess pantheon, formed by two veteran deities, the Evernight goddess and the Earth Mother. They protect women, maintain close ties with each other, and have a clear alliance. However, what remains intriguing is the presence of Emperor Rosal's youngest daughter, who stands out within this system. Following that is the Fool pantheon, which seemed obscure before the Faith Revolution. This deity, who appears to have good relations with all the gods, had no legends in existence in the early days. It was not until the holy text titled, The Arrival of the Fool, the Path of the Supreme Pillar, circulated that everyone realized the drastic changes of the past few years were inextricably linked to this great being. Now, His favorite angel of fate has become the powerful god of luck, and in his grand ceremony, even the god of paradox once sought refuge under his wings. Beyond these four, there is the most talked about pantheon, that which believes in the god of paradox and preaches, all-embracing, true self, valuing self, for me. This pantheon has only one true god, the god of paradox, but it boasts the most complex network of relationships. It is said that this deity has four consorts. One is the god of law and order, the eldest daughter of Black Emperor Rosal, Queen Mystic, the angel of erudition and mystery, Bernadette Gustave. One is the youngest daughter of the omniscient and omnipotent creator, the angel of music and art, Sophia Eva. One is Mr. Fool's most beloved follower, capable of discerning hearts, the angel of justice and etiquette, Audrey Hall. And the last one, without any grand background, is known as the angel of cats, the protector of all cats in Loan. It is said that she was once a cat kept by the god of paradox when he was still immortal, and is also the origin of the cat-keeping custom in the current Loan Empire. In the West District of Backland, on the lawn of a detached house, a child who looked 2 or 3 years old, with his short legs, happily hugged a large golden cat with shiny fur. However, at this moment, a hint of helplessness suddenly appeared on his chubby face, and at the same time, the surrounding maids and nannies all showed a blank, vacant expression. Why have you started raising cats too? It's not easy to get assassin pathway characteristics these days, is it? A slightly teasing voice came from outside the yard. Klein Moretti, wearing a semi-tall silk top hat, a double-breasted long coat, and holding a silver inlaid cane, walked in. In Loan, anyone who doesn't raise a cat will be treated like a newly arrived bumpkin, though I don't mind it myself. The child spoke with a mature voice, but halfway through, he suddenly remembered something, blinked twice fiercely, and then asked with slight hesitation. You're not that guy in disguise, are you? That guy? You mean Feng Shui? Klein couldn't help but laugh at the remark, then shook his head and said. He went back to Eastchester County to deal with family conflicts. By the way, why aren't your parents home? Father went to Feniport for further studies, and mother is attending a tea party at Mrs. Kalin's next door. She'll probably be back in about an hour. Though he had changed families, the god of luck, Will Osepton, still Caldwell, waved his hand with a bit of helplessness, stood up with some effort, and then said thoughtfully. Is there something you need me for? Oh, by the way, did you bring a gift? Nothing in particular, mainly just to see how you're doing. By the way, with so many believers, why are you still short on ice cream? Klein smiled, then conjured an ice cream cup as if by magic, and asked. What flavor do you want? As long as it's not from a historical projection, it's fine. Will rolled his eyes adorably, then sighed. My group of believers is simply indescribable. The offerings they give are either horseshoes, rabbit feet, 4-leaf clovers, or durable pastries that only old people eat. I can't exactly issue a divine oracle demanding ice cream offerings, can I? And this kind of food is relatively expensive itself. I don't want to burden my lower-level believers too much. 4-leaf clovers and such are quite nice. Oh, then let's have a 4-leaf clover-flavored ice cream. Klein smiled mischievously, lightly tapping the ice cream cup with his silver-inlaid cane. A light green ice cream scoop, exuding a fresh fragrance, landed in the cup. It wasn't a fake from the historical void, but food shaped by the power of wishes, absolutely fulfilling the wish. Why didn't you give me a horseshoe flavor? Will sighed, but still took the ice cream cup with his chubby little hands and began to eat it spoon by spoon. Not to mention, although the taste sounded a bit strange, the deliciousness brought by the power of miracles was guaranteed. Watching Will eat, Klein found a place to sit down casually, and then spoke. It's about time you started preparing for a church and scriptures, isn't it? It's not ideal to always have the fool's church help you spread your faith, is it? Sigh, I knew you weren't just coming to give me ice cream. Will sighed, then readily shoveled 2 large scoops of ice cream into his mouth, gently tapped his head, and said. The church can be left to the people of the Council of Fate, and they'll prepare the scriptures too. For publicity, just say I'm your subordinate god, and that's fine. I've been busy for over 2,000 years, let me enjoy my childhood. While the Lord of the Mysteries and the God of Luck were discussing matters of faith, on the other side of the continent, in an orphanage, another young true god also welcomed guests. Why are you here again? Tolsna looked at the pair of men and women who appeared before her, a helpless expression on her face. I don't want to either, but what can I do when my old man and old lady want to see their granddaughter? Rosal sighed helplessly. Although the misunderstanding had been resolved by bringing the steam maiden, who looked like a shut-in, home, after seeing his daughter-in-law, the old couple started clamoring to see their granddaughter again, even saying things like, 2 shut-ins raising a child, no wonder the daughter isn't close, which even made the steam maiden a bit upset. But the steam maiden getting upset was probably because she treated Rosal as her own son back then, but Rosal wasn't close to her. That's why you shouldn't have come to me in the first place. Tolsna glanced at the bespectacled woman beside Rosal, a clear look of disdain on her face. Rosal was one thing: firstly, he was an outer deity remnant, and secondly, he had truly become her father both legally and ethically. But what was the steam maiden? When he was an angel, this little girl hadn't even been born yet. Now she was to be her adoptive mother. Does I, the god of bound, I, the god of sufferers, not care about face? How about I make a robot and take it back? The steam maiden scrutinized Tolsna from head to toe, her cold eyes seemingly measuring certain data, while Rosal gently pinched his brow, saying helplessly, "Your robot is prone to problems over there, as you can't completely get rid of the Beander component yet, can you? What if the granddaughter suddenly explodes while the old couple is holding her? Have you considered the consequences? Then what should I do? Now the old couple calls me all the time. If I don't let them see their granddaughter, I can't even focus on college." The steam maiden scratched her head irritably. If it weren't for the enticing electronic technology over there, she wouldn't be willing to waste time on those two insidious guys' territory. So why don't you just acquire knowledge directly with your Beander abilities? Do you have to go to college? Rosal felt his head ache even more, but the steam maiden resolutely shook her head and said, "The process of learning is also a manifestation of civilization. Directly acquiring knowledge and acquiring it through learning are completely different. I must go through this process to truly analyze the core of their technology. If there weren't these restrictions, your manuscripts would have been deciphered by me long ago. If you want to show affection, go show it in your intis. I'm very busy." Seeing the two people gods openly displaying their affection as if no one else was there, Tolsna couldn't help but reprimand them. Rosal, however, was unmoved. Instead, his eyes darted around and he said, "Speaking of which, your current doctrine is copied from feng shui, isn't it? Want to know more complete content? Want to know more related knowledge? By the way, even things like ascetics in this world were copied by the true creator from our era." Tolsna listened to Rosal's words, took a deep breath, and after a moment, said helplessly, "You win, but wait a moment. Tomorrow is Day of Indulgence, I need to tell Reinette about it." Although there weren't many firecrackers, the lanterns and spring couplets in front of the shops, as well as Theaspring Festival Grand Sale, banners occasionally seen, still reflected the festive atmosphere of the Spring Festival. Huang Dao, who had reverted to his greasy middle-aged appearance, walked down the slightly noisy street. Beside him was a woman who looked to be in her mid-20s, with fair skin, slightly disheveled hair, thick glasses, and an air of scholarly refinement. And between the two was a 7 or 8-year-old girl, looking reluctant and clearly following along out of desperation. This combination gave off a very mismatched impression, but for some reason, everyone who saw them immediately thought, this is a family of 3. Little Huang is home. I heard your mom say you found a university student. Good heavens, your daughter is already this big. I didn't even hear about you having a wedding. When they reached the entrance of the residential area, an old man playing chess downstairs waved familiarly. Huang Dao's expression was slightly awkward, but he still nodded and said, "It's just that Kong Signing still has to go to school, so we didn't have a wedding. We just got our certificate." "How can that be? You should at least let your relatives and friends know. Otherwise, what will the girl's family think of you?" Listening to a group of uncles and aunties start to criticize him one after another, Huang Dao, who had long decided to use less Beander abilities here, still secretly rubbed his hands. Instantly, the sense of time in the residential courtyard was distorted, directly skipping the lengthy discussion. After an awkward but polite farewell to the overly enthusiastic uncles and aunties, Huang Dao led Steam Maiden and Huang Xiaona towards his home. "Are all the people here like this?" Huang Xiaona looked up, her expression strange, at Huang Dao, who was holding her hand. Huang Dao lightly scratched his cheek, while Steam Maiden, who was using the alias Kong Signing, said earnestly, "This is a unique civilization ecology of this country. Our civilization is closer to the Western countries here, leaning towards a commercial ecology, a civilization built around contracts. This one, however, leans towards a human emotion ecology, built on the foundation, blood ties, and morality. Although this relationship is primitive and unstable, it has unexpectedly formed a very interesting civilization. You're a science and engineering major, not a social work major." Huang Dao listened to Kong Signing begin to enter long-winded mode and felt a headache. Kong Signing, upon hearing this, said earnestly, "Don't assume my major. A paragon is the manifestation of prominent disciplines. Both humanities and natural sciences fall within my domain. Especially the succession of civilizations, it's an important part of my authority. If I wanted to, I could even add elements like art and literature to my divine name. No, that's Sophia's domain. If you mess with that, that guy might come looking for trouble. Huang Dao quickly stopped his wife's dangerous idea. Kong Signing also shook her head and said, I know, so I'm just talking. The god of steam and machinery actually knows how to joke now. It seems this place is really strange. Don't forget what you promised me. Huang Xiaona shook her head, then said, I know. The complete set of D&D rulebooks, and also poverty alleviation plans and disability welfare stuff from here, right? I'll get them for you. Huang Dao, seeing that they had already arrived at the doorstep, immediately promised. Huang Xiaona nodded upon hearing this, her expression immediately becoming obedient. The strange family of three arrived at the front door. As the doorbell rang, a slightly aged face opened the door. You rascal, you could have called before coming back. Isn't this Kong Signing? Oh, and Nana. Come in, we're making dumplings. Nana, what do you want to eat? Tell Grandma. Watching his own mother pull his wife and daughter into the house, leaving him alone at the door, Huang Dao smiled and shook his head, then quickly followed them in. The rascal's back. Apparently noticing the movement at the door, Huang Dai, who was sitting in front of the sofa, watching TV and making dumplings, turned his head and glanced at Huang Dao, then frowned. You should occasionally pay attention to your image. Don't make it look like Kong Signing is going out with an elder when she's out with you. I know. Isn't it because I'm afraid you won't recognize me? Huang Dao quickly changed into his slippers, put the prepared ingredients in the kitchen, and casually retorted. I'd recognize you even if you turned to ash. Hurry up and come help. I'll wash my hands and be right there. Quote. Kong Signing, even though getting the certificate counts as marriage, there still needs to be some sense of ceremony. When are you two going to have a wedding? Huang Ma pulled Kong Signing to sit on the other end of the sofa, continuously stuffing various snacks to Huang Xiaona while nagging. Mom, Kong Signing is doing her doctorate now, let's wait a bit. Huang Dao interjected somewhat awkwardly, and then his head was slapped by his father. She was just in university when she had a child, and you were capable of that then, but now you're concerned about her studies. I don't mind. Any time is fine. Kong Signing was holding Huang Ma's hand, secretly forcing a slight blush onto her face. Huang Dao's eyes immediately widened upon hearing this. You didn't say that back then. I also want to understand the wedding customs and culture here. Kong Signing gave Huang Dao a look packed with information, then reached out and stroked Huang Xiaona's head, smiling amidst the girl's slight disdain and inability to avoid it. However, Huang Ma clearly noticed this keenly, and nodded thoughtfully, saying, Kong Signing, I wanted to tell you last time, Huang isn't good with children, and you still have to go to school, so it's not convenient to have Nana with you. Why don't we help you take care of her? Can you change your address? Huang, always makes me feel like you're calling a dog. Huang Dao said, half protesting and half changing the subject. Huang Ma immediately turned her head and glared at him. Giving birth to a dog is better than giving birth to you. I don't even know what you're thinking, a 7-year-old child, and you never even told us. Do you still have parents in your eyes? Poor Kong Signing, I really don't know how she's managed these past few years. No, Nana goes to a boarding school. Huang Dao tried to smooth things over, but Huang Dai frowned. Boarding school. Is it reliable? I saw on the news that bullying in boarding schools is much more serious than in regular schools. Who would dare bully her? Huang Dao was a bit speechless at the time, but Huang Xiaona suddenly seemed to think of something and said, Dad, I want to stay with Grandpa and Grandma for a while. Huang Dao's eyes widened, looking incredulously at Huang Xiaona, who had called him Dad for the first time. You didn't say that before. Mom is also studying nearby, and boarding school isn't fun at all. Then it's settled. It's the New Year holiday, so you go handle the transfer procedures. As for the academic record, your old man, still know a few old friends, so you don't need to worry about it. Huang Dai confidently waved his hand, settling the matter, and then added. And while we're at it, let's have the wedding during the new year. The 15th day of the first lunar month is a good day. No. Fine. I'm not responsible for what happens in the end. Walking on the familiar street, Zhou Mingrui, carrying the specially customized ingredients from Student Moon, always felt a sense of unease. However, when he tried to perceive it with a seer's spirituality, there was no result. Sigh, it's probably feng shui trying to trick me again. I'll go to Saphira Castle to divine later. Klein shook his head helplessly, but he had no intention of divining immediately. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but that he couldn't. Because this earth is located within a subspace built by the divine realm, which is above the three sequences of paradox, the Fool, and God Almighty. If he ascended to the gray fog in this world, it would undoubtedly increase Saphira Castle's erosion of this realm, and it was very likely to destroy the established balance. Although the destruction of this balance would not immediately cause an impact, and could be fixed by simply mending it, Klein still did not want to bring trouble to this earth because of his own mistake. After all, this is everyone's common home, and one cannot just throw trash around indiscriminately just because cleaning up is not difficult. Knock, knock, knock. Although there was a doorbell, he still habitually knocked on the door. Coming. A kind voice, yet one that carried an imposing aura that made people listen involuntarily, came from behind the door. Soon after, a middle-aged woman who looked no older than 40 opened the door. Seeing Mother Zhou Mingrui almost instinctively raised his hand, but he quickly remembered that he was currently wearing casual clothes, not a double-breasted long formal suit, and he wasn't wearing a semi-tall silk top hat either. However, Mother Zhou didn't notice her son's abnormality. She proactively reached out and took the ingredients from his hand, muttering, "I told you not to bring anything, just bring a person back." At this point, Mother Zhou suddenly looked outside the door twice, then a very obvious expression of disdain appeared on her face. She rolled her eyes at Zhou Mingrui, then turned and walked into the room without saying anything. "Isn't your preferential treatment too obvious?" Zhou Mingrui looked at Mother Zhou's appearance and couldn't help but shake his head. Mother Zhou, hearing this, complained, "Let me tell you, your first love is already pregnant with her second child. If you don't find me a daughter-in-law this year, don't blame me for disowning you as a son. Actually, you two could also raise a small one." Zhou Mingrui muttered in his heart, but he didn't dare to speak. After all, these words were somewhat disrespectful. Of course, he believed that under the effect of Student Moon's healthy ingredients, his parents living younger and younger would definitely not be a problem. Seeing that Zhou Mingrui didn't object, Mother Zhou's expression softened a little. As she put the ingredients into the refrigerator, she said, "Go chat with Father Zhou. Recently, he's been obsessed with that online novel. You should talk to him too, don't let him ruin his eyes." "Oh mother, you're a teacher, and you can't persuade him. What good can I do?" Zhou Mingrui sighed and turned towards the living room, where he saw Father Zhou sprawled on the sofa, his head twisted, looking at the novel with enlarged font on his phone. "Hey, you're back. Didn't bring a daughter-in-law." Father Zhou saw his son, but he didn't have Mother Zhou's stern attitude. Instead, he happily waved his hand. Zhou Mingrui shook his head and said, "How could it be that easy? I only graduated a few years ago. My job isn't even stable yet." That's true." Father Zhou seemed to be a reasonable person, nodding his head, then he said again, "By the way, if I want to tip this book, how much is appropriate?" Zhou Mingrui looked at Father Zhou in confusion. In his impression, Father Zhou's salary was all handed over to Mother Zhou. How could he still have money to tip? This novel is quite interesting. The protagonist's name before he transmigrated is actually exactly the same as yours. I think this is fate, so I want to tip a little." "Really? What's the name?" Zhou Mingrui's nerves suddenly tensed. He felt that the chill he experienced before coming home might be about to return. "Lord of the Mysteries. It's a pretty popular one recently. Do you know it?" Father Zhou casually threw out a name, and Zhou Mingrui's face immediately darkened. He forcefully maintained his expression with a clown's ability and tentatively asked, "Is it that story about Beyonders? You still read Western fantasy? Look at what you're saying. What's wrong with Western fantasy? You weren't even born when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons." Father Zhou immediately felt underestimated, but Zhou Mingrui's attention was no longer on when Father Zhou played Dungeons and Dragons. He just wanted to drag Feng Shui out and ask him what he was thinking. "Then what do you think of this story?" After a moment of hesitation, Zhou Mingrui asked somewhat guiltily. He was also a little curious about how Feng Shui wrote this story. Would there be another, Lord of the Mysteries calendar? "It's all right, that little Zhou in it is quite heartbreaking." Father Zhou shook his head, then added, "But the author of this book is quite interesting. At first, I thought Elizabeth would be the female lead, but then the protagonist faked his death. Later, I thought Sharon would be the female lead, but then he went to sea." Sigh, "It's really frustrating." That. Zhou Mingrui wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and said helplessly, "Is there a possibility that this book is actually without a female lead?" "Impossible. Absolutely impossible." Father Zhou shook his head confidently and said, "What kind of web novel would be written without a female lead? If there's no female lead, why would the author create so many CPs?" Good heavens, you even know the term, CP. Zhou Mingrui began to furiously beat snow in his mind, yet he carefully sealed off his thoughts to prevent that guy from sensing it and directly memory jumping him. After a period of frantic internal complaining, Zhou Mingrui finally adjusted his mindset, then took out his phone and started searching for the novel. However, he wasn't too worried in his heart. After all, no matter how perverse Feng Shui's tastes were, he still had his professional integrity. He definitely wouldn't write an ending directly about recreating Earth and then Zhou Mingrui returning home or similar plot points. However, what truly made him relax was finding the reason for the chill he felt before coming home. After all, at midnight, the shoe that has dropped to the ground is always more reassuring than the one that has yet to fall. Now that he knew the source of his unease, he could finally relax and enjoy this New Year's Eve. Although it was still some time until evening. Just as he was flipping through the Lord of the Mysteries, which had no devil traces, and chatting with Father Zhou, the doorbell suddenly rang. Klein immediately frowned slightly. Why would someone be paying New Year's visits on New Year's Eve? Before he could get up, Mother's footsteps were already heard. Then, Klein heard Mother Zhou's breathing suddenly become rapid, and at the same time, a familiar voice came from the doorway. Happy New Year, Auntie. I'm Furs, Zhou Mingrui's friend. Quote exclamation mark quote. Zhou Mingrui's eyes suddenly widened, and then Mother Zhou's voice came from the doorway in an extremely exaggerated tone. Xiao Zhou, why didn't you say anything in advance that a friend was coming? The moment Klein heard Miss Magician's voice, he immediately concluded that this must be Feng Shui's doing. After all, this star system, which includes Old Earth, was entirely evolved based on the power of the three sequence above God kingdoms. Besides him, Feng Shui, and the true creator, the only other individuals with access were the goddess and Huang Dao, two outer deity remnants. Forget Furs, a sequence 4 secret sorcerer, even Mr. Dor in his prime couldn't get through. But more importantly, when she was talking to his mother, she was speaking Chinese. One must know that Chinese, as a language erased from the spirit world, could only be learned from him, Feng Shui, or Huang Dao unless one came here to study it. And Huang Dao, due to the deterrence of the diary, would absolutely not proactively teach Chinese to others. Therefore, the only one who could possibly have taught Miss Magician Chinese was Feng Shui. It's just, why would Feng Shui send Miss Magician to him? Or rather, why would Miss Magician be willing to come over? Just as Klein's mind raced through all sorts of possibilities, Mother Zhou's voice rang out once more. Old man, stop reading your novel. Our son's friend is here. Got it, got it. Father Zhou gave little Zhou a bewildered look, then tucked his phone into his pocket. He then saw his wife leading in a girl with an excellent demeanor. The only thing Father Zhou found somewhat concerning was the faint smoky marks on her fingertips. However, he wasn't an old-fashioned person and didn't hold the belief that women shouldn't smoke. He merely began to ponder if it would be troublesome for this young couple to quit smoking when they eventually wanted children. Happy New Year, Uncle. Furs, seeing Mr. World, with yet another changed face, looked slightly shy, but then bravely gathered herself and greeted Father Zhou. Father Zhou casually chatted with Furs for a few sentences. Listening to the girl's conversation, he couldn't help but feel that she wasn't someone his son could have hooked up with, and quickly shot him a look that demanded an explanation. Zhou Mingrui was also extremely embarrassed at this moment, unsure what to say. After a moment of hesitation, he finally gritted his teeth and said, Dad, Mom, this is Furs. She's a novelist. Not a web novelist, but traditional literature, the romance and mystery kind. I knew this girl had such a good temperament. Little Furs, tell me, how did you meet my silly son? Mother Zhou gave Father Zhou a look, signaling him to go to the kitchen to cook. She then sat beside Furs and began chatting. Hearing his mother's clearly pointed conversation style, Zhou Mingrui felt his scalp tingle and prayed in his heart that Miss Magician would, due to cultural differences, not understand his mother's hints. Furs, being a romance novelist herself, how could she not understand Mother Zhou's meaning? She immediately followed the question, steering the conversation in a somewhat ambiguous direction. Mother Zhou immediately asked curiously. A novel? A romance novel or a wuxia novel? Where was it published? It was serialized in a small newspaper, but the content was supernatural, stories about ghosts in hospitals and doctors. Oh, and I used to be a doctor too. It's over. She understood. Zhou Mingrui suppressed the urge to slap his hand over his face. Just as he was wondering how to interrupt this seemingly normal but potentially problematic conversation, a sound suddenly entered his ears. Ding dong. What's going on today? Mother Zhou heard the doorbell, slightly surprised. She then patted Furs's hand and said, Little Furs, you and Mingrui chat for a bit. I'll be back soon. Watching his mother walk towards the entrance, Zhou Mingrui's eyes immediately narrowed as he said to Furs. How did you get here? Ah, this, that. Furs had initially doubted if she had come to the wrong place, seeing Zhou Mingrui's gentle demeanor. But at this moment, with that glare, a jolt of electricity shot from her soul straight to her head. That's right, this was definitely Mr. World. Swallowing gently, Furs gritted her teeth before saying, well, Mr. Devil said your home is in Mr. Fool's divine kingdom, and there's a festival here. But here, adult men celebrating a festival without a female companion would be looked down upon, so he asked if I wanted to come over. Do you know that this, female companion, is on the premise of marriage? Zhou Mingrui felt an urge to cover his face for a moment, and then he realized with some horror that Miss Magician actually nodded, blushing. What's going on? Shouldn't Miss Magician be very afraid of me? Isn't she in that kind of relationship with Zio? Why is she making this expression? I haven't considered this aspect at all. Zhou Mingrui suddenly felt his head swell like a bucket. As a slightly traditional and somewhat reclusive young man, he was quite ill-equipped to handle such direct actions as a girl specifically visiting his home during the new year. After all, these kinds of problems weren't like divine wars, they couldn't be solved with authority. Thinking of this, Zhou Mingrui secretly gritted his teeth. It seemed the confrontation between Miss Justice and Bernadette was still too gentle. He'd add more fuel to their fire when he got back. Just as dark flames ignited in Zhou Mingrui's heart, Mother Zhou's voice came through again. Mingrui, your friend is here. Another friend of mine. Zhou Mingrui instantly bristled. Did Mr. Devil call more than just Furs? He turned to look at Furs and immediately saw a wary expression on her face. At the same time, an intellectual face appeared in his line of sight, along with his mother's conversation, filled with a sense of having met a long-lost friend. Edwina, you're also a teacher, aren't you? I could tell at a glance. How did you and my little Zhou meet? Well, one of my students got lost during the holidays, and he helped bring her back. Edwina secretly shot Furs a meaningful look, then started discussing educational topics with Mother Zhou. Although the subjects were different, the principles of education were the same. Seeing this, Furs knew that if things continued like this, her first mover advantage would be lost. She immediately moved closer and inserted herself into the conversation as a literary worker. For a moment, Zhou Mingrui felt as if a true creator was rapping in his head, the kind that hadn't recovered its sanity. Father Zhou, hearing the commotion, emerged from the kitchen and immediately gaped. He then crooked his finger at Zhou Mingrui. Seeing this, Zhou Mingrui, as if granted a great pardon, dropped the excuse, I'm going to help Dad cook, then got up and slipped into the kitchen. Son, what's going on? Which one is the one for you? The moment Zhou Mingrui entered the kitchen, Father Zhou immediately leaned in gossiping, looking out at the two highly qualified prospective daughters-in-law while inquiring about his son's attitude. As for what the two girls were thinking, it was obvious to anyone who wasn't an idiot that both of them were interested in his son. How to put it, they're just friends. Friends. Zhou Mingrui explained somewhat futilely. Honestly, he truly only considered them friends. After all, before defeating the Lord of the Mysteries, he had no mind for such things. But now that he was relaxed, he realized that Furs and Edwina actually seemed to have a little something for him. Ding dong. Damn it. Feng Shui, you want me dead, don't you? As Zhou Mingrui wore an expression of, I'm tired, just destroy it, hurry up, Mother's surprised voice once again reached his ears. Who are you looking for? Do you understand Chinese? Quote. Hearing this, Zhou Mingrui's expression immediately changed. He walked out of the kitchen towards the entryway and then saw, from a distance, a doll-like young lady standing at the door, holding a gift bag. Sharon. Zhou Mingrui's eyes widened instantly, as the current situation was completely beyond his expectations. After all, although Furs and Edwina had unexpectedly shown up, they had both disguised themselves to some extent. Under Feng Shui's unreasonable authority of what is seen as truth, their original appearances had shifted to be more Asian. While he could recognize them at a glance thanks to Clown's talent, their actual facial features appeared softer than their originals, so Father Zhou and Mother Zhou hadn't found anything amiss. But Sharon was completely different. She had appeared at the door without any disguise, in her true form. Her exquisite, exotic features, combined with a Western-style dress that could barely be considered casual wear, immediately plunged his mother into a strange mood. Hello, Auntie, is this Zhou Mingrui's house? Fluent Chinese came from Sharon's mouth. Mother Zhou almost immediately turned her head, giving Zhou Mingrui a look that said, I don't remember raising you like this, before smiling and saying, yes, you are. My name is Sharon, and I am Zhou Mingrui's friend. Sharon gave a slight curtsy by lifting her skirt, but it completely flustered Mother Zhou. She wondered if she should return the gesture now. How do you return a curtsy? Should she lift her skirt too? Would an apron do? Ahem, Mom. Don't just stand at the door. Sharon, you come in too. Noticing Mother's awkwardness, Zhou Mingrui immediately stepped forward to smooth things over. Although Mother Zhou really wanted to chat with this potential foreign daughter-in-law, she felt she first needed to adjust her current emotions. Why are you here? Zhou Mingrui glanced at Edwina and Furs, who were glaring at each other in front of the sofa. He didn't immediately lead Sharon over but asked in a low voice. Of course, he was already certain that this was another one of Feng Shui's doing. However, Sharon's answer surprised him a little. I went to Melissa's place to find you, heard you were out, so I prayed to the God of Sufferers, and then learned you were here, so I asked him to send me over. God of Sufferers? How could he? Oh, Rosal. Zhou Mingrui grimaced, but still spotted the blind spot. Then what's with your Chinese? This is a power obtained by praying to Paradox. I once traded some Paradox pathway charms with Mr. Snow, and some of them I haven't used yet. Sharon replied righteously, leaving Zhou Mingrui speechless, thinking, your initiative is not restrained at all. As if guessing Zhou Mingrui's thoughts, Sharon nodded decisively and said, today is a day of indulgence, no problem. Good heavens. Klein was speechless, but in the time it took for these few sentences, Edwina and Furs had already focused their attention here. The moment they saw Sharon, their eyes widened instantly. Sharon, how could you? Sharon, aren't you sup? Their gazes suddenly met in midair, then they looked at each other, and their eyes towards Sharon immediately became dangerous. Some things are like a narrative trick. When you don't notice it, the truth can be right in front of you and you'll still overlook it. But when you truly realize it, everything becomes incredibly simple. Undoubtedly, the brother of Miss Melissa, whom Miss Sharon likes, is the true form of Mr. World. Although he didn't know why Mr. World, who lived in Mr. Fool's divine kingdom, also had a brother and sister there, recalling Miss Justice's expression towards him at the previous tea party, Sharon's inexplicable sense of superiority, and the way she occasionally looked at the two of them when chatting with Melissa, the entire truth was unveiled at this moment. Watching the atmosphere in the living room gradually turn tense, Zhou Mingrui secretly unfolded the Fool's domain. Although he felt that these three wouldn't actually fight in his home, even the clash of auras from three demigods could cause anomalies that distort reality. Although the three were still very restrained now, when it came to women arguing, who could say for sure? Meanwhile, Father Zhou and Mother Zhou in the kitchen were also looking at each other. After a brief silence, Father Zhou finally said, which one do you think it is? They all look like it. Mother Zhou clicked her tongue, a hint of disbelief on her face. How did her son, who couldn't even get a first crush in school, manage to win the hearts of these three high-quality women? Mother Zhou didn't doubt that she had misjudged the situation at all, because there was no possibility of misinterpreting the looks in those three girls' eyes. Okay. Well, what do you say, could it be our son? Did he learn some kind of hypnotism or something? Father Zhou looked out of the kitchen with a strange expression, watching the three girls glaring at each other, and said in a very uncertain tone. Are you crazy from reading too many novels? How can there be such a thing in this world? Mother Zhou rolled her eyes at Father Zhou, but after glancing at the four people who were now peacefully sitting on the sofa and chatting, she said with a bit of uncertainty. There shouldn't be, right? But what if there really is? What do we do? Should we call the police? Just as the elderly couple began to doubt their son's character, Zhou Mingrui suddenly got up, walked towards the balcony, and said towards the kitchen. Mom, Dad, I'm going to make a call. Got it. Mother Zhou thought for a moment, then gave Father Zhou a look and said. You watch the stove, I'm going to try to get some information. Quote. Beep beep. Sorry, the user you have dialed is temporarily unavailable. If you play with me again, I'll get serious. Zhou Mingrui listened to the clear, but unmistakably Feng Shui's, automated voice on the phone, suppressing his anger. Hee, don't be so agitated. How do you like the New Year's gift I prepared for you? Feng Shui's voice came from the phone, and Zhou Mingrui's expression grew increasingly ferocious. My parents are already suspecting that I've learned some kind of carp-flipping hypnotism. Didn't we agree not to just bring people in? But old Huang brought steam maiden in Huang Xiaona, didn't he? I thought you couldn't really bring a marionette home for New Year's, could you? Besides, these three really like you. Wait a moment, I'll send you a video. The moment the words fell, Zhou Mingrui's phone received a video in a way that violated the infinite data transmission speed of this world. Opening it, he saw Sharon singing praises of love. Alright, anyway, how do we clean this up now? Zhou Mingrui rubbed his face, letting clown's power start working again, but Feng Shui's voice chuckled and said. At worst, marry one under each identity, I remember that's called concurrent inheritance, or something. Who asked you about that? I mean, how do I explain this to my parents? Don't you dare tell me to use fooling, or something. Zhou Mingrui glanced towards the living room, confirmed no one was eavesdropping, and continued. This mess you're doing, you have to fix it for me. Alright, it's actually quite simple, just bring out a proper girlfriend. Feng Shui replied with a laugh, and Zhou Mingrui immediately flared up. Where am I going to find a proper girlfriend? Have Leonard cross-dress? Or should I sacrifice myself? How about Integra, what do you think? Feng Shui's teasing voice came from the receiver. Klein felt a bucket of cold water poured over his head. He knew just how shameless the person on the other end of the phone was, and immediately said. No, bro, I was wrong. Don't come. Absolutely not. I'll handle it myself. Really. Don't be shy, Integra has a demoness personality, she can definitely carry the whole scene. Feng Shui's laughter grew more unrestrained, but Zhou Mingrui's head ached even more. He said in an extremely serious tone. This is my relationship problem, I will face it myself. Really? Really? Then work hard. Click. A busy signal came from the receiver, but Zhou Mingrui had no time to get angry. Instead, he directly unfolded his domain, completely enveloping his residential area. Regardless of whether that guy was joking or not, he had to ensure that absolutely no one else would be able to enter his home today. Your Holiness, here is last month's financial statement. Your Holiness, here is this month's expenditure list. Your Holiness, the donations from the Church of Law and Order, the Full Church, the All-Life Church, and the Church of Light have been received. After deducting daily expenses, there is still a surplus. How should it be handled? Your Holiness, the first batch of prosthetics customized from the Steam and Machinery Church has been shipped. Here is the preliminary distribution list. Your Holiness. In the chained cathedral of the Church of the Sufferers in Fenaport, Renique Tinakal was rapidly processing the documents constantly being delivered to her. Because the God of Sufferers was skipping work, all prayers were diverted to her, and now, various ecclesiastical commissions also required her attention. Sharon was originally a helper, but she took advantage of the day of indulgence and ran off somewhere, and hasn't returned. The only high-ranking members left at the Church of the Sufferers headquarters were her and Marich. Marich still had to deal with Beander commissions. Sigh. Renique Tinakal looked at the increasingly tall stack of documents in front of her and the growing number of voices in her mind. She finally let go, grabbed her head forcefully, and directly plucked off her beautiful head. She tossed it upwards in front of the reporting congregants, and the head flew into the air, immediately splitting into more than a dozen ethereal projections. They floated there, watching the headless body rest against the back of the chair. Everyone exchanged glances for a moment. No wonder she can be the Pope of the Church of the Sufferers. Everyone else at most loses an arm or a leg, but Your Holiness directly loses her head. Of course, no one would actually voice such disrespectful thoughts. After a brief moment of astonishment, they heard the suspended heads begin to speak. Financial reports, come to me. Relief plans, come to me. Prosthetics issues, come to me. I'm in charge of internal church affairs. Undoubtedly, Miss Renique Tinakal was still very busy today. Quote. I say, you, what's your name, Alger, right? How much longer until we arrive? On the vast sea, the ghost ship named Azure Avenger rose and fell with the waves. The parasite named Mobert lay on a deck chair, though there was clearly no sunlight in the sky of the misty sea. I don't know, Alger glanced at this ruffian-like fellow, completely unable to imagine that he was once a noble living in the fourth epoch. However, considering that he was the descendant of a certain angel and a family member of an important member on this voyage, Alger decided to give him some face and added. We have now deviated from the traditional route. In this sea area, perceptions, including time, are chaotic, and there is also pollution from the aura left by an evil god. It's difficult to accurately determine the time. If you want to know the specifics, ask the navigator. I just don't want to ask. What do you want to ask? Shaddaz leapt down from the crow's nest on the mast and stared at the slacking Mobert, asking. Mobert's neck recoiled at her words, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Shaddaz, however, didn't humor him. She grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and said to Alger. Sorry, I won't let this guy bother you anymore. But, I'm more curious why you didn't fly up. Alger looked at Shaddaz, who was dragging Mobert with one hand and climbing the crow's nest with the other, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Oh, my god, you're too violent. At least save me some face in front of outsiders, okay? Never mind, don't worry about my face, do as you please. Mobert was thrown onto the crow's nest by Shattaz and grumbled dejectedly. But before he could finish, he saw Shattaz raise her fist. How embarrassing, how could I have a descendant like you? Suddenly, a somewhat aged yet familiar voice rang out in his mind. Mobert instantly shivered, looked left and right, and then said in his heart. Who are you? You brat, you don't even recognize me anymore. The voice carried a hint of faint anger, beneath which was a tone of kindness and relief. Old man. No, that's not right. I know, you're Aemon, right. I'm telling you, I'm a believer of the god of paradox, and this ship is the asset of Mr. Fool. Aemon has already gone to the cosmos. Pales muttered, feeling a bit weary. Why were all the surviving descendants of the Zoroaster family like this? Who knows if you didn't leave an avatar here? Even Jacob's ancestor could have been you in disguise. Ow. Mobert's words were cut short as a sharp pain shot through his body. He then said in astonishment. Bloodline punishment. It really is. No. Could Aemon have stolen the spell? No, Aemon shouldn't be able to steal this bloodline spell. My old man is an angel under Mr. Fool, he shouldn't have his fate stolen by Aemon. Call me great-grandpa. Old man, I met a foolish nightwatcher earlier. He claimed to be your disciple. Do you know his name? I said, call me great-grandpa. So, first prove that you really are the old man. Ow. In a room within an abandoned ancient castle hidden in the forest, sunlight pierced through the gaps in the heavy curtains, falling upon a dark coffin. Suddenly, the lid of the coffin made a creaking sound and slowly began to move sideways. With a thud, it fell to the ground. A few seconds later, a bewildered man with black hair, brown eyes, and bronzed skin sat up from the coffin. After his bewildered expression, a hint of confusion appeared. That's not right. Why haven't I lost my memory? Reaching out to rub his slightly throbbing forehead, he found that his lost memories were now neatly arranged in his mind in chronological order, from most recent to furthest past. It seemed that if he wished, he could, by his own will, fade some of them. Mr. Azek, who had not lost his memory, was well aware that this state was abnormal. He did not act immediately but instead slightly turned his neck, letting his gaze sweep across the room. Then, a series of letters scattered casually beside the coffin lid caught his attention. Among them, one was particularly conspicuous, as it, unlike the others that had slid off when the coffin opened, floated in midair, as if urging him to open it immediately. Azek Eggers reached out, grabbed the envelope, and opened it, revealing the brief text inside to his eyes. Dear Mr. Azek, first, congratulations on awakening from your slumber. Please forgive my presumptuous tracking of the messenger, as I obtained a rune that can mend souls from a friend. You should now be free from the trouble of soul fragmentation and should no longer lose your memory. However, because the repair of the soul requires time, I did not immediately awaken you. Many things have happened to me during this time. After reading the letter, a slightly complex emotion flashed in Azek's eyes. Then, he bent down, picked up each letter, read it, and then pondered. When all the letters were read, he let out a long sigh, seemingly wanting to write a letter, but then stopped the process of searching for paper and pen. Perhaps, a face-to-face conversation should be the first interaction after awakening. When Zhou Mingrui returned to the living room after his call, he found Father Zhou sitting on the sofa, looking completely bewildered, neither watching TV nor playing with his phone, seemingly at a loss for what to do. From the kitchen, the laughter and chatter of Mother and the three ladies occasionally drifted out, but for some reason, that cheerful conversation sent a shiver down Zhou Mingrui's spine. Son, sit down, let's chat, just us two. Father Zhou patted the sofa seat next to him, took a gulp of tea from his mug, his expression very world-weary. Seeing that look, Zhou Mingrui suddenly felt an urge to run, but he still sat down, waiting for Father Zhou to continue. Unexpectedly, Father Zhou didn't bring up the topic of the three potential daughters-in-law. Instead, he picked up his phone, pointed at the novel page for Lord of the Mysteries, and asked. Mingrui, do you know the author of this book? Ah, why do you ask? Zhou Mingrui tilted his head, but Father Zhou gave him a look that said, don't try to hide it from me, and replied. Do I even need to think about it? The protagonist is named Zhou Mingrui, and those three in the kitchen, one is a foreigner named Sharon, one is an author named Furs, and another is a teacher named Edwina. Anyone who isn't an idiot would figure it out. No wonder your expression was so strange when I mentioned this novel earlier. Could it be that the author used you all as prototypes? Ah, haha, that's right. Zhou Mingrui let out a dry laugh, thinking he had overthought things. He was right, even if a normal person saw someone similar to her sharing a name with a character in a novel, they wouldn't suspect the novel was real, would they? Seeing his son's somewhat awkward expression, Father Zhou took it as confirmation that he had guessed correctly. He immediately cupped his hand over his mouth and said in a voice only the two of them could hear, "But seriously, which one do you actually like? I think that Furs is pretty good. But our family isn't that old-fashioned, as long as you like her, your mother and I have no objections." Ah, this. Zhou Mingrui's expression stiffened slightly. He could guarantee that the three people chatting with his mother had already focused their attention on this side. After a moment of thought, he decided to come clean. "Father, to be honest, I haven't really considered that aspect. I always just thought of everyone as friends." "Are you serious?" Father Zhou's face showed a hint of surprise, and he scrutinized his son with a strange look. It wasn't until Zhou Mingrui started to feel awkward that he finally spoke. "Son, tell me honestly, you do like girls, right?" "Father, what are you saying?" Even though Zhou Mingrui had prepared himself for his father's interrogation, he never expected his father to ask such a question, and he instantly bristled. Seeing his son's expression, Father Zhou relaxed a little and took a deep breath, saying, "Phew, you scared me to death. But if your orientation is normal, how can you be with three such beautiful women and still only think of them as friends?" Listening to his father's words, Zhou Mingrui's expression became increasingly difficult to maintain. Considering common sense, it was indeed true, whether it was Furs, Sharon, or Embodiment, they were all high-value individuals whose bare faces could outshine a crowd of heavily photoshopped people, and their personal charm went without saying. Not to mention Ms. Edwina's ship full of admirers, Sharon's puppet potion itself enhanced her temperament, and as for Furs, she was so beautiful that even pirates would pay 10 souls for a night. Note 1. Any normal male interacting with them would inevitably develop some romantic thoughts, wouldn't they? But that was under normal circumstances. What kind of life had Zhou Mingrui lived these past 3 years? If, back in Ting'an, he still had a slight desire to settle down, marry, and have children, then the moment he left Ting'an and embarked on the Beander journey, he began living a precarious existence. When even survival was difficult to maintain, who would be in the mood to consider such matters? However, now that everything had settled, and Zhou Mingrui could live the peaceful life he had always longed for, he had to consider these issues. Although he was a great sequence above, the Lord of the Mysteries who controlled the spirit world, he was ultimately, he, and not, he. Humanity meant that he still retained various desires as a human being. Therefore, he had to confront the feelings of the three ladies. Even without considering his power as a sequence above, merely by relying on a seer's spirit vision and a clown's control over expressions, Zhou Mingrui could easily discern the thoughts others harbored towards him. Undoubtedly, Miss Furs, Miss Sharon, and Ms. Edwina did indeed harbor romantic feelings for him. But precisely because of this, he felt an even greater headache. After all, he couldn't just take them all on as feng shui suggested, could he? Even if it were possible there, what about here on Earth? Only one person could be brought back to meet his parents. Wouldn't that be unfair to the others? All right, even the esteemed Mr. Fool, the great Lord of the Mysteries, would eventually and inevitably develop some, "I want them all," thoughts. After all, this is also proof of humanity. Seeing his son begin to think seriously, Father Zhou finally relaxed a bit. It seemed that while this silly boy was a bit slow, he wasn't entirely without feelings for those girls. But if that's the case, how should he choose? It's a good thing there are only 3. Wait a minute. 3. Father Zhou's eyes suddenly became sharp. He looked at Zhou Mingrui, then at the phone in his pocket. A thought suddenly popped into his head, and after a moment of contemplation, he decided to test him. So, just as Zhou Mingrui was examining his inner feelings, trying to determine which lady he had stronger romantic feelings for, he heard his father suddenly ask out of the blue. "Mingrui, why do I keep seeing you looking out the window? Could it be that someone else is coming?" "Huh, how could that be?" Zhou Mingrui suddenly shivered, instinctively Note 2 refuting it. But then he realized that doing so was a bit of a self-incrimination, and for a moment, he wanted to throw a blind stupor at his father. Father Zhou didn't know he had just skirted the edge of becoming 0v0, but he saw his son's nervous expression, and his own expression instantly became strange. After a moment of hesitation, he spoke. "Could it be that there really is an Elizabeth who hasn't arrived yet? By the way, where do you know so many foreign girls from?" Hearing his father mention Elizabeth, Zhou Mingrui actually breathed a sigh of relief, thinking to himself that as long as it wasn't Integra, it was fine. At the same time, he gave a very serious-looking perfunctory answer. "I mainly joined a fan club, you know, a tarot cards fan club. You know, back then, Oh, right, that first love, wasn't it? You learned tarot cards for that girl, and then you got dumped." Father Zhou slapped his hand, suddenly enlightened, Speaking of which, this plot where you join a fan club to pursue a girl, get dumped, but then immediately meet many high-quality girls in the same fan club, why does it sound so familiar? What kind of light novel protagonist treatment is this? Can we not bring up that first love? And speaking of which, father, isn't your range of interests a bit too broad? 4 women were busy in the kitchen, while Zhou Mingrui and Father Zhou sat on the sofa in the living room. Father Zhou, however, was engrossed in his phone again, but Zhou Mingrui felt like he was sitting on pins and needles. Every question Mother Zhou asked from the kitchen made his heart pound, and it was a good thing he was already a high-sequence Beander, otherwise, this would have surely given him a heart attack. Zhou Mingrui cherished Old Earth greatly. Unless absolutely necessary, he rarely used his Beander abilities there. It wasn't that he worried about his Beander abilities attracting strange things, it was just that his life as a Beander was quite exhausting. He wanted to live like an ordinary person when he came here. Just as he was lost in thought, Father Zhou suddenly frowned, put down his phone, and said somewhat furtively. Mingrui, you know the author of this book, right? What's wrong? Zhou Mingrui nodded slightly. Seeing Father Zhou's somewhat strange expression, even with his clown Beander abilities, he couldn't quite figure out what Father Zhou wanted to say. Didn't you say that the characters inside are based on real people? So I just wanted to ask, do these demonesses also have real-life prototypes? Zhou Mingrui's expression darkened, and Father Zhou immediately explained. No, I'm just curious. Are they male or female in real life? What did they look like? Do you have photos? Father Zhou, you appreciate cross-dressers too. Zhou Mingrui thought he had greatly overestimated Father Zhou's trendiness, but he never expected him to go even further. Is that how you talk to your Father Zhou? Father Zhou smacked the back of Zhou Mingrui's head again. I already said I'm just curious. After all, can men really be more beautiful than women? It's not as exaggerated as you make it sound, and Triss is a woman. She's already married. Zhou Mingrui wiped away non-existent cold sweat from his forehead, but inwardly he grumbled. Although the couple's genders swap every once in a while. I see, Father Zhou nodded thoughtfully, redirecting his attention to his phone screen. Klein looked at Father Zhou's unenthusiastic expression and suddenly wondered if he should pay attention to Father Zhou's social circle. He now highly suspected that his Father Zhou had joined some strange otaku chat group, dinner's ready. After a long ordeal of occasionally answering Father Zhou's embarrassing questions, Mother Zhou's heavenly call was a great relief to Zhou Mingrui. He immediately got up and walked to the dining room, where he saw a New Year's Eve dinner that looked rather mismatched. In the center of the table was the classic braised fish, surrounded by 4 substantial dishes, 4 joy meatballs, braised prawns in oil, garlic pork slices, and sweet and sour pork ribs. These dishes were relatively normal. In previous years, the Zhou family's New Year's Eve dinner would be complete with these, plus cold dishes like preserved eggs, aspic, cucumbers, and peanuts, and a bowl of clear soup, at most with a few dumplings that might contain coins. But what was placed around these dishes today made Zhou Mingrui's expression twitch slightly. First, the soup bowl didn't contain the usual clear tomato and egg soup or seaweed and egg drop soup, but rather a creamy white mushroom cream soup. Between the cold and hot dishes, there were also several extremely strange-looking dishes. Stewed lamb with tender peas, black truffle foie gras, Fenaport seafood paella, daci pie, Loan-style sausage salad, and there was even what looked like iced tea but was actually hand-mixed sweet iced tea. Zhou Mingrui could even see Mother Zhou and Father Zhou exchanging glances, their expressions clearly indicating. All 3 girls can cook, and their skills are pretty good. Zhou Mingrui sighed, looking somewhat helplessly at the Fenaport paella and daci pie. Whether it was Loan, Fenaport, or Intis, their dietary structures leaned more towards Western cuisine, making it difficult to distinguish between staples and dishes. It's not that they don't have them, but for them, staples are also a type of dish, which is why the table had 3 types of staples plus dumplings simultaneously. Old Zhou, turn on the TV, the Spring Festival Gala is about to start. Mother Zhou called out. Father Zhou, hearing this, found the remote and turned on the TV. As the familiar music played, Zhou Mingrui momentarily forgot his embarrassment. Although people always say the Spring Festival Gala gets worse each year, as a wanderer who had been away from home for 3 years, seeing this program still felt very comforting. However, Sharon, Furs, and Edwina had somewhat strange expressions watching TV. Sharon was fine, just a little surprised, while Furs was nodding and shaking her head simultaneously. Without a doubt, Klein understood that she must have gotten some writing inspiration but decided to put it aside for now. As for Edwina, good heavens, her eyes were practically glowing. Cough cough. Klein quickly coughed twice, reminding Edwina to mind the occasion even if she wanted to research. Edwina immediately realized, temporarily putting aside her desire to study the box that had no spiritual aura, and redirected her attention back to the dining table. Then Mother Zhou raised her glass and said, "May all your wishes come true in the new year." Although they didn't quite understand what was happening, everyone understood the custom of clinking glasses. 6 glass cups filled with sweet iced tea clinked together, making a crisp sound. After taking a sip of the sweet iced tea, Mother Zhou smiled and said, "Quickly, try it and see how it is." As Mother Zhou spoke, Father Zhou, as the head of the household, first picked up a piece of fish from the center of the table. Then everyone else began to use their chopsticks. Zhou Mingrui finally relaxed a little, listening to the fat man's humorless crosstalk on TV and eating Mother Zhou's cooking. But just when he was most unguarded, Mother Zhou ambushed him. "Mingrui, don't just eat the same old dishes." "Oh, this," Zhou Mingrui jolted, immediately dragged out of the warm atmosphere. Looking at the new dishes Mother Zhou's gaze swept over, he unmistakably felt 3 gazes focused on him. Gulp, swallowing the food in his mouth, Zhou Mingrui somewhat conflicted used the serving chopsticks to scoop himself 2 mouthfuls of seafood paella, then picked up a few pieces of porcini mushrooms, a piece of lamb, a segment of Loan-style sausage, and a small piece of dashi pie. Seeing the gazes on him grow more intense, Klein lowered his head and bit into a piece of lamb. His eyes suddenly lit up slightly, but then his expression became a little strange, because the taste wasn't like that of the other world, but rather like, "I learned it from Melissa." Sharon's slightly cool voice came from beside him. Father Zhou immediately turned to Zhou Mingrui and said, "Melissa? Is that Melissa?" "Ah, yes. She's a junior of mine, from the mechanical engineering department. Her brother and I are friends," Zhou Mingrui explained awkwardly. Father Zhou was a little suspicious, but then he nodded. This Sharon clearly looked like a foreigner, so it was normal for her to specifically learn 1 or 2 Chinese dishes from someone. It was just the way she spoke. Why did it sound like his son often ate with that Melissa? Could it be that Melissa was actually the main one, and these 3 were just sneaking around? Zhou Mingrui immediately realized Father Zhou had misunderstood, but the more he explained such things, the more troublesome it became. So he immediately turned his attention to the food in his bowl, and under the expectant gazes of Furs and Edwina, he began to use his clown Beander abilities to perform what could be called a food show level act. PS1. First, it's about the clown potion and expressions. You first need to know what expression represents what to perfectly control your own expressions, just like how Klein, after becoming a faceless, could precisely remember the characteristics of every face. Simply put, spectators deduce psychological states through behavior, while clowns can directly obtain the other person's thoughts through micro-expressions but cannot interpret them deeply. Additionally, a seer's spirit vision can also read the aura colors of a spirit body to determine mood. In the original novel, Klein interpreted the sad receptionist lady. PS2, don't doubt Father Zhou reading light novels. Nowadays, everyone really reads novels. My Father Zhou reads light novels and often complains about male protagonists being too kind and emotionally done. Also, my Mother Zhou loves reading female-oriented novels, and she listens to audiobooks on speaker. I've mentioned this before, it once ruined my writing flow to that extent. PS3, as for the way Father Zhou and son talk, it generally depends on the person. For example, my aunt's husband and my cousin even curse like they're from Zan while playing Honor of Kings. The taste is really good. I rarely eat this kind of food. What is it called? Father Zhou watched his son eat with an expression like a food show judge, and he also picked up a few mouthfuls. Although his expression wasn't as exaggerated as his son's, overall, it was quite good. This is, just as Edwina was about to introduce the history and illusions of Lindbergh sausage salad, Zhou Mingrui immediately said. Western food, it's all Western food. This is German sausage, this is Spanish seafood paella. Father Zhou immediately kicked his son. You didn't make it, who told you to introduce it? I'm just afraid you'll hear place names like Lindbergh and Fenaport. Zhou Mingrui said with a wronged heart. Edwina immediately understood and quickly apologized. Ah, I'm sorry. Father Zhou hadn't reacted to what was happening for a while, but Mother Zhou suddenly understood, glanced at Edwina, and then said. I understand, occupational hazard, right. Sometimes, when I open my mouth, I like to talk at length. Although it wasn't due to that factor, Edwina immediately accepted the excuse and conveniently guided the topic to the problem students on her class ship. As a teacher, Mother Zhou immediately felt a resonance. The two of them chatted while eating, leaving Father Zhou, Zhou Mingrui, Furs, and Sharon aside. Fortunately, they were already at the dining table, so no one felt awkward. They ate and occasionally echoed a few topics thrown out by Father Zhou, and the atmosphere was quite harmonious. Although for Zhou Mingrui, Father Zhou, and Mother Zhou, the Spring Festival Gala had become increasingly boring, for the three of them, Furs, Sharon, and Edwina, it was exceptionally novel. The diverse songs and dances, as well as the crosstalk and skits, were all forms of entertainment they had never encountered. Father Zhou quickly noticed this. Seeing that everyone had finished eating, he spoke. "You've all been busy cooking all day today, so leave the dishes to the two of us." With that, Father Zhou gave Zhou Mingrui a look, pulled him, and started walking towards the kitchen. "By the way, where are the three girls from?" Father Zhou asked Zhou Mingrui while washing dishes. Hearing his father's question, a flood of thoughts instantly flashed through Zhou Mingrui's mind. As someone who frequently engaged in schemes with various beyonders, he quickly realized the essence of his father's question and immediately said, "Sharon is from England. Furs and Edwina are both from the south." "I see, I heard people in the south don't really watch the Spring Festival Gala." Father Zhou nodded thoughtfully, but Klein said, "It's mainly because they don't have anyone to watch it with. After all, they don't go home for the new year." "Is that so?" Father Zhou thought about it and felt there was nothing wrong with it. His wife was a teacher, so he naturally understood that teachers nowadays basically had no holidays. No matter how much they said tutoring was not allowed, it still had to be done, otherwise, the children wouldn't keep up with the progress and would suffer in the high school and college entrance exams. When it comes to studying, once one person starts to compete intensely, if the rest don't follow suit, they will inevitably suffer. As for Furs, from their earlier conversation, he knew this girl must be traveling all over the country, so it was quite normal for her not to go home often. Thinking of this, Father Zhou refocused his attention on his son and said with great incomprehension, "They don't even go home themselves, yet they came here for the spring festival. It seems they really have feelings for you. Which one do you actually like?" Zhou Mingrui's expression immediately changed, because his keen intuition had already noticed that a perception had been cast from the living room. "Still haven't decided." Father Zhou rubbed his head and said somewhat helplessly, "Although matters of the heart are your young people's own business, as a father, I still have to advise you, it's better to make a choice early in these matters. You don't want to be chopped with a cleaver, do you?" "So, Father, what exactly have you been watching? How do you even know about cleavers?" "And I really don't," Zhou Mingrui muttered with a headache, but his father directly interrupted. "Don't what? If you don't have such intentions, then make it clear early. Don't keep people hanging. When it's time to break up, break up. It's better for everyone." "So, some things aren't that easy to decide." Zhou Mingrui sighed helplessly. He, of course, understood this principle, but for him, he had only truly begun to realize today that he was being pursued by three high-quality women. This was like someone being confessed to by three women with whom they had some acquaintance on the same day and being asked for an answer. That was simply impossible. In fact, if there was only one person, Zhou Mingrui might have agreed to try dating. After all, he was ultimately, he, and not, it. He still had some emotional needs. But the problem was, with three people coming at him at once, he found it difficult to make a decision. Now, he suddenly understood the feeling of that devil gentleman who suffered from decision paralysis to the point of losing control. Now he had an urge to lose control. Looking at his son's conflicted face, Father Zhou also sighed, patted his shoulder, and said, "Forget it, I won't force you. You think it through yourself, just don't think about becoming a sea king." "So, Father, what have you been watching? Why do you know so much?" Zhou Mingrui found it hard to complain about the breadth of his father's interests. He even suspected that among the "I'm good" comments in the bullet chats of certain video websites, some were contributed by his own father. The dishwashing process wasn't long. After all, Chinese people value having a surplus every year, so there's always a little leftover from the New Year's Eve dinner. Only the plates and bowls that were used were washed. When the father and son returned to the living room, Zhou Mingrui saw the three women chatting happily with his mother, as if they hadn't heard his conversation with his father at all. Seeing this relatively harmonious scene, Zhou Mingrui also breathed a sigh of relief. He avoided the three ladies, sat down next to his mother, took a sip from his water glass, and pretended to focus his gaze on the television to avoid getting involved in the women's conversation. But just then, he suddenly saw a familiar face appear on the screen. PFF'd. Zhou Mingrui spat out a mist of water, staring incredulously at the public service announcement appearing on the TV. Although the face looked a bit young, he would never mistake it. "Amen. Amen." Furs heard him and immediately turned her attention to the television, then saw a missing persons notice that left her somewhat at a loss. Below the photo of a young version of Amen, who looked only 6 or 7 years old, with a slightly thin face and a faint black birthmark around his right eye, were 4 prominent characters. Help him go home. February 19, 2019, the 15th day of the first lunar month. Various luxury cars lined up in front of the high-end hotel, and red carpets and flowers decorated the entrance passage. Anyone who saw it would understand that a wedding was being held here today. Congratulations. Same to you. The families of the newlyweds stood in the banquet hall of the auditorium, greeting guests and accepting red envelopes representing congratulations. Huang Dao, wearing his wedding suit, moved among the guests and relatives, his expression slightly stiff. Kong Signing was not present at the moment, but he still established communication with it through his Beander abilities. I say, where did you find all these parents and relatives and friends? Receiving Huang Dao's question, Kong Signing, who was analyzing the social construct of marriage, smiled slightly and then said, the parents are androids. Some of the guests are university classmates, and some others posing as parents, relatives and friends are also androids. Androids. Huang Dao was slightly stunned and asked in surprise. How come I didn't notice at all? Technology will innovate. It's not just the mother pathway that understands human alchemy. After all, the components of the human body are, to put it plainly, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and trace elements. It's just that the soul aspect is difficult to replicate, so I used programs instead. Kong Signing proudly introduced the results of its research during this period, including brain-computer interfaces, chip memory, rapid cultivation, and other terms from science fiction novels, all flooding into Huang Dao's mind. If he hadn't also ascended through the savant pathway, he would probably have started to crash by now. To prevent the rest of the time from becoming a human alchemy seminar, Huang Dao interrupted the steam maiden's incessant chatter and directly led the topic to the conclusion. So these androids are all stable enough, right? They won't explode, and they won't suddenly become paralyzed. It would be unlucky if someone died during the wedding. No, it's just that the Paragon's high precision was used for component processing, achieving a level of precision impossible with current technology. The technology itself already has a theoretical foundation, and no Beander power is involved, so they won't explode. At this point, the steam maiden's words paused slightly, and then it added with some uncertainty. Even if a chip occasionally short-circuits, it's not a problem. I can immediately detect their abnormalities and then use extraordinary abilities to repair them. At most, they'll just look stunned for a while. At most, it's just a bit of dizziness from low blood pressure. As long as you're confident, then it's fine. Anyway, don't scare my parents. Huang Dao sighed helplessly. Before he could get a reply from the steam maiden, his dad dragged him away to meet some of his old friends. Mr. Devil, is Emperor Rosal holding his wedding here? Audrey walked on the bustling street, her beautiful large eyes constantly scanning the passing vehicles. She had a strong curiosity about this hometown of Emperor Rosal, Mr. Fool, and Mr. World. You should call me Feng Shui here. Snow is also fine. Also, when you meet him, you can just call him Huang Dao. Feng Shui corrected her helplessly, but Audrey couldn't help but cast her gaze towards the lady beside him who exuded a considerable sense of oppression. I'm fine, and I'm not angry that he remarried without telling me. I'm just very curious about what hometown looks like. Bernadette said in a tone lacking emotion, but anyone with a brain would know she was lying. However, seeing her gaze constantly sweeping over those female passers-by who were still wearing stockings in the cold weather, maybe part of it was true. So why didn't Emperor Rosal want Bernadette to come? Audrey asked softly. Feng Shui smiled. Perhaps he doesn't want his daughter to understand his dark history. It's like, if Justice's Great Adventure was written in a language only you understood, you wouldn't want others to learn that language, would you? You promised not to mention that book. Audrey's cheeks immediately puffed up, but then another voice interjected. Compared to that, don't you think it's a bit conspicuous for us to walk together? So if you think it's conspicuous, then turn into a cross. Feng Shui reached out and rubbed Lily's head. Lily, who was lying on his shoulder, immediately let out a comfortable meow. True creator, curse. Sophia let out a rude foreign curse, then unyieldingly tried to squeeze to his left side. Although Bernadette was sulking, she didn't give way at all, naturally reaching out and wrapping her arm around Feng Shui's left arm. Seeing this, Sophia immediately walked to the right, only to find Audrey looking at her with a pitiful gaze. True creator, curse. Sophia cursed and grumbled, then glared at Bernadette and said, "You're in a bad mood today, I won't bother with you." With that, she suddenly unfolded her psychological invisibility, then transformed into a stream of light and drilled into Feng Shui's clothes. The next moment, Feng Shui felt the pain of thorns pricking his skin. Sigh. Feng Shui was already accustomed to this situation and walked into the hotel with the 2 women and 1 cat. Then, Feng Shui, isn't this Zhou Mingrui? Looking at the acquaintance he met at the hotel entrance, Feng Shui's face immediately broke into a brilliant smile, because beside Zhou Mingrui stood 3 ladies glaring at each other. And it seemed Sharon was clearly unwilling to turn into a doll for Zhou Mingrui to hold, unlike Sophia. Of course, it's also possible that Sharon was willing, but the others were not. What a good deed you've done. Zhou Mingrui saw Feng Shui's smile and immediately bristled with anger, almost gritting his teeth as he said. You're also here for old Huang's wedding. Did he give you an invitation? As if you have one. Feng Shui rolled his eyes, then casually pulled out an invitation. Although to Zhou Mingrui, this thing was as fake as could be, unfortunately, few people in this world could see through the paradoxes, what is seen is truth. However, his side was similar. After all, old Huang and the steam maiden getting married certainly wouldn't give them a chance to come and watch the show, but the problem was. Of course I have one. Zhou Mingrui decisively pulled out his invitation, and it actually looked real. You didn't steal that, did you? Feng Shui asked with a hint of malice, but Zhou Mingrui calmly threw him a look that said, can the Lord of the Mysteries' business be called stealing? Then he pulled out his phone, found the childhood photo of, sending him home, and said. Speaking of stealing, what's this all about? Ah, this. Feng Shui grimaced, and finally said in a very small voice. Well, what I'm about to say, you absolutely must not be scared. What I'm about to tell you, you absolutely must not be afraid. Don't worry, I am Mr. Fool's angel, I won't be afraid. Zhou Mingrui glanced at Bernadette and Miss Justice opposite him, then at Furs, Sharon, and Edwina, and finally chose to put on his disguise. Eamon is on this planet. What? Zhou Mingrui's face darkened, and his whole body tensed up. The power that escaped in that instant almost made everyone around him start acting foolish. Calm down. Didn't you say you weren't afraid? Feng Shui rolled his eyes. What happened to picking up the cue? But Eamon, how could he? Wait. It must be you. You must have let him in, right? Zhou Mingrui immediately turned dark, grabbing Feng Shui by the collar and walking towards a corner. The 5 ladies nearby completely ignored them, and even Lily jumped from Feng Shui's shoulder into Audrey's arms, watching the 2 walk into the alley next to the hotel. Don't be nervous, this is old Earth. Outputting power above an angel level can easily disrupt the surrounding environment. You wouldn't want tomorrow's newspaper to have news about NASA discovering some strange celestial body, would you? Feng Shui followed Zhou Mingrui's pull into the alley, his expression still that cynical smile. Zhou Mingrui took 2 deep breaths to calm his emotions. Although he was already the Lord of the Mysteries, he still instinctively had an adverse reaction to one, or rather, countless omens infiltrating his hometown. Tell me, what exactly is going on? Simply put, the true creator thinks Earth is more suitable than the vast and sparsely populated universe for Eamon to learn how to be a human, Feng Shui said with a helpless shrug. Zhou Mingrui's expression grew even stranger upon hearing this. Let Eamon learn to be human. On Earth, are you sure he won't cause some major disaster? Don't worry, there are only 666 omens on Earth in total. Except for the main body, which still retains its memories, all other clones have no memories. They will live on this planet as ordinary people, Feng Shui calmly answered Zhou Mingrui's questions, but Zhou Mingrui became even more uneasy. But there's still the main body, isn't there? He still has his memories. That's why I told you to let me finish. Feng Shui sighed. The true creator used, completely removing the pollution left by the celestial worthy, as an excuse to provide him with some psychological intervention, and also demanded that he concentrate most of his Beander characteristic on one clone, allowing the true creator to slowly treat it. Theoretically speaking, although the Eamon on this planet now has a weak sequence 4 status, he possesses so little spirituality that he can't even activate spirit vision. And he is also very eager to understand what humanity is. But with Amon's mind, even without Beander abilities, he's still a top-tier marauder. He'll cause a huge mess. Zhou Mingrui absolutely could not relax about Eamon, but Feng Shui just wore a reassured expression and said. That photo is Amon's main body. He's currently forcibly fixed at the age of 6 or 7. Under my authority of, what is seen as truth, no method can make him grow up except for the natural passage of time, unless you fool with time. I certainly won't. Zhou Mingrui immediately declared, and Feng Shui calmly nodded. So, a bespectacled elementary school student who looks like a child but is extraordinarily intelligent, do you think he can be Conan or something else? Forget about causing trouble, it's good that he hasn't been abducted and sold to the mountains yet. Wait, abducted? Zhou Mingrui showed an incredulous expression, but Feng Shui remained calm. That's right, the true creator and I sent him to a pretty good orphanage, but the kid ran away, himself. That photo of yours is the missing persons notice from the orphanage. Won't that backfire? Although Eamon being abducted sounded quite interesting, he suddenly worried about Eamon becoming even more twisted. What do you think humanity is? If a person can only see the good side, that's not humanity, it's just a deception. Moreover, Eamon is a mischievous child with thousands of years of wisdom. Raising him in a honeypot will only make him feel that everything is too fake. Let him experience human suffering, and then learn to grow in hardship. Only then can he deepen his understanding of humanity and gradually develop a relatively complete personality. Even if this personality is extreme, it's still much stronger than his original, divine nature. Besides, do you think the world's strongest psychiatrist's grasp of psychology is inferior to yours? Listening to Feng Shui's words, Zhou Mingrui also relaxed a bit. With the true creator, his biological father, watching over him, he, an outsider, seemed to have no need to worry too much. However, out of his psychological shadow regarding Eamon, Zhou Mingrui still cautiously asked. Are you sure Eamon doesn't have Beyonder abilities now? To say he has none isn't absolute. He should still retain a small part of the Marauder's abilities, right? Like finger dexterity or something, alright, instead of that, it's more important to go watch old Huang's fun. Meanwhile, 5 beauties of various appearances had been standing outside the hotel for a moment, which was already enough to attract the attention of those around them. After feeling the increasing number of gazes focusing on them, Furs, the most thin-skinned, finally couldn't help but say. How about we go in first? All right. Bernadette nodded, taking out an invitation from her handbag. She had just conjured it up on the spot. After all, for a king of angels of the hermit pathway, a paper product that contained no Beyonder power could be easily replicated with a glance. By the way, what's the procedure for attending a wedding? Guided by the usher at the entrance, the 5 took the elevator to the grand ballroom. Seeing the red paper signboard at the entrance with the words, Mr. Huang Dao, and Ms. Kong signing, Furs suddenly hesitated. Although on the surface, it seemed similar to the wedding traditions over there appeared to be many differences. At least, weddings over there didn't have a bunch of Roselian characters cut from red paper pasted on the walls. So, Roselian is indeed some kind of rune with mystical power, right? When we went to Zhou Mingrui's house before, we even saw an inverted Roselian at the entrance. Furs sighed. Although she had gained the ability to hear and read Roselian through the ordination ritual, there seemed to be some restriction on the written characters. One had to truly master them through the process of learning. That's called Chinese characters. Also, although there are concepts like word of power and charms circulating in this world, for now, these characters are just for blessings, similar to a mysterious ritual of psychological comfort that doesn't possess actual efficacy. As Bernadette spoke, she recalled the Xinhua dictionary she had bought earlier, and her eyebrow twitched involuntarily. Although she regretted it deeply, having already memorized the entire Russell's diary, she understood what kind of strange things her father had written in his diary the moment she got that dictionary and compared it. Old man. Old man. Inside the banquet hall, Huang Dai, who was happily entertaining relatives and friends, was suddenly tugged twice by Huang Ma. He immediately turned his head to look at his wife, only to see Huang Ma constantly winking at him. Seeing this, Huang Dai immediately ended the conversation and followed Huang Ma a few steps to the side. What's wrong? Look over there. Huang Ma used her eyes to point Huang Dai towards the entrance. There, 5 women of different styles were walking in. Besides 2 flower-faced individuals, Furs and Edwina were disguised, the other 3 were foreign-faced, and one of them even held a cat. Did they go to the wrong place? Huang Dai frowned. His family had no dealings with foreigners, and judging by their appearance, they didn't look like they were here for a wedding. Probably not. They gave a red envelope earlier, and they also have an invitation. Huang Ma shook her head, but Huang Dai frowned and said. But why is the woman in the middle looking so sullen? Do you think she might be our son's ex? Huang Ma exercised the imagination expected of a loyal viewer of an 8 p.m. drama, and Huang Dai immediately shook his head upon hearing this. Don't say such things carelessly, today our son is getting. At this point, Huang Dai's expression and words almost froze simultaneously. Huang Ma followed his gaze and saw her son staring intently at the sullen-faced foreign girl, his face showing only shock and surprise. And a bit of panic, it seemed. No way, right. Huang Dai and Huang Ma had, after all, lived for 5 or 6 decades, and their experience was considerable. Seeing their son's shocked expression, they immediately realized that things were not simple. However, today was their son's wedding, and no matter what, nothing could go wrong at a time like this. Almost simultaneously, the two elders exchanged a look. Huang Dai turned and walked towards Huang Dao, while Huang Ma greeted the 5 beautiful maidens who had suddenly appeared. Son, what's going on? It's not your ex-girlfriend, is it? Huang Dai leaned close to the bewildered Huang Dao and whispered. Huang Dao shivered, his expression helpless, thinking, if only it were an ex-girlfriend. At the same time, he explained to his father. Huang Dai, it's not what you think. This is very complicated. Speaking of which, all 6 of them are here, but there should be 2 more people. More complicated than an ex. I can't even imagine what you've been through. Huang Dai twitched the corner of his mouth, suddenly recalling what his son had said when he forced him to marry earlier. I don't care what it turns out to be in the end. For a moment, his thoughts were complex. But then, he noticed a blind spot. 6. Aren't there only 5 people? And that cat? Huang Dao sighed, his gaze constantly searching the venue, but he didn't find those 2 familiar figures. Cat. Huang Dai wasn't very good at distinguishing cats, but the kitten in the arms of the blonde foreign little girl was indeed very intelligent. He shook his head, then left Huang Dao and walked towards the group. No matter how complicated the situation was, he couldn't let anyone disrupt his son's wedding. Leaving aside the issue between his son and Xiao Kong, the wedding itself had many old friends invited. If anything went wrong, it would be a huge loss of face. Seeing his father step forward, Huang Dao immediately followed, afraid that these few might say something outrageous if they weren't careful. Of course, he was also continuously chanting the honorific names of the fool and paradox in ancient Hermes language in his heart, determined to annoy these 2 out, no matter how bothersome it was. Hello, Auntie. I'm Audrey, and I came with my boyfriend. But he ran into a friend, and they're chatting outside, so they let us come in first. As a socialite, spectator Audrey took on the role of chatting with Huang Ma. Although Bernadette was displeased that she had taken the initiative, considering that it was inappropriate for her to call this lady either Auntie or Grandma, she tacitly allowed Audrey to speak. Compared to these 2, the trio brought by Zhou Mingrui remained in a state of watching the show. After all, none of the 3 were the type who enjoyed interacting with people, especially when there was the spectacle of Emperor Rosal to watch. Of course, Sharon was genuinely just watching, while Edwina was conducting human observation, attempting to analyze how this world coped with such complex interpersonal relationships under different cultural backgrounds. And Furs, she was recording material. Although she was mostly laid back, she wouldn't miss an opportunity like this to write a biography for a legendary figure like Emperor Rosal. Although it would definitely be a fictionalized unofficial history, and the publication date was uncertain, she felt it would be a waste not to record it. Utilizing her spectator abilities, Audrey conversed very smoothly with Huang Dai and Huang Ma. Before long, Feng Shui and Zhou Mingrui also walked in, shoulder to shoulder. Seeing these 2, Huang Dao finally breathed a sigh of relief and said, Dad, Mom, these 2 are my good brothers. This is Zhou Mingrui, and this one is Feng Shui. They, Lord of the Mysteries. Huang Dai suddenly exclaimed in surprise. Huang Dao was completely flustered and asked in astonishment. Huang Dai, how do you know about the Lord of the Mysteries? Isn't it just a novel? If you young people can read it, why can't an old man like me? Speaking of which, I had this feeling just now. By the way, that book wasn't written by your friends, was it? Huang Dai's face suddenly showed a look of realization. Immediately, he saw everyone's gaze focused on the man named Feng Shui. Haha, haha, the article is naturally formed, a masterpiece obtained by chance. I am just a transcriber. Feng Shui laughed heartily, but with this laugh, the atmosphere actually calmed down. Because Huang Dai finally thought of a reasonable explanation for his son's strange expression. In The Lord of the Mysteries, that Bernadette opposite, she seemed to be his son's daughter. Who wouldn't be awkward about that? Huang Ma had clearly not read The Lord of the Mysteries. Seeing her husband's expression suddenly relax, she was a little puzzled for a moment, but then received an expression from her husband that said, I'll explain later. Everyone resumed their normal guest greeting mode, while Huang Dao awkwardly led the group to the side and said, Why did you come? It's Emperor Rosal's wedding after all, of course we have to come and see it. Zhou Mingrui, influenced by Feng Shui's fun-loving nature, joked at this moment. Huang Dao's face darkened upon hearing this. He glanced at Bernadette helplessly. Bernadette noticed her father's gaze and immediately stiffened, saying, I came with Feng Shui, it has nothing to do with you. It's your freedom who you want to marry. No need to explain to me. Bernadette forcefully interrupted Huang Dao's words, again uttering something she had said when she revived Huang Dao before. I've already finished reading all your diaries. Gah. Huang Dao made a non-human choking sound, and he looked like he was about to faint. However, he was still a sequence 0, and after a brief mental disorientation, he immediately cast an angry gaze at Feng Shui. You taught her? No, I just granted the ability to hear and speak to those who transmigrated. I didn't teach them the written language. Feng Shui shook his head, but Huang Dao looked unconvinced. That's impossible. Chinese must be taught to be learned. Even if deciphered, it would take an extremely long time without text for comparison. So there's this. Bernadette casually pulled out a Xinhua dictionary, as well as a pinyin chart used by kindergarten children learning pinyin. It had various common objects corresponding to pinyin syllables. Like an eagle next to ing, and a musical note next to in. The combination of pinyin is very simple. As long as you understand spoken language and then look up one character at a time, even if you don't understand Chinese, you can still understand the meaning. So why did you bring Bei here? Huang Dao once again focused his gaze on Feng Shui, but Bernadette said calmly. Because I really want to know what your homeland, that you constantly yearn for is like. Speaking of which, are stockings and short skirts really a custom of the homeland? No, this is a misunderstanding. ×3. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.